The Byzantine Empire of Greece. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 101, Only after being taught a lesson will one be more obedient. After discussing war preparations with his cabinet, Otto also had to deal with Palmerston's return to Greece. As Greece's war preparations became increasingly elaborate and no longer concealed, Britain was fully certain that Greece would intervene in this Near Eastern war. However, Palmerston was in a bad mood at this time. Mahmud I had firmly rejected his proposal for an Ottoman-Greek alliance and even used the Macedonian legion to coerce Greece, forcing Otto to come and appease Greece. As expected, upon meeting, Otto went straight to the point. Your Excellency, Greece, out of long-standing friendship, trusts Britain and is willing to temporarily set aside its hatred for the Ottoman Empire to join forces against the Egyptians. But what I want to know is why the Ottoman Empire's army seems to be moving towards the border between the two countries. I think this is just a misunderstanding. After all, your country's continuous military expansion is bound to make the Ottoman Empire somewhat nervous, Palmerston said calmly, passing the buck back to the Ottoman Empire. But the information I received from the Ottoman Empire tells me that Mahmud I seems to be considering sending troops to attack Greece. Otto said bluntly, does your country intend for me to treat invaders who are preparing to invade my territory as allies? Seeing that Otto seemed to fully understand Mahmud I's attitude, Palmerston couldn't help but curse inwardly. Greece and the Ottoman Empire were both so troublesome. Why couldn't they just obediently follow the British's lead? Regardless of his inner thoughts, the work had to be done. Palmerston declared loudly, Your Majesty, rest assured, Britain can guarantee that the Ottoman Empire's army will never dare to enter Greek territory on its own initiative. Mahmud I's current attitude does not represent the Ottoman Empire's final decision, and Britain will soon persuade him to change his mind. Seeing Palmerston's confident assurance, Otto said, To date, Greece has already consumed a great deal of resources in preparation for war. It is absolutely unacceptable if it cannot obtain the benefits it deserves. Your Majesty cannot make empty promises and expect me to wait. After all, even in the preparation stage of war, a large amount of money is continuously spent. As a small country, Greece does not have that much money to waste. Rest assured, at most 3 months, Britain will definitely be able to persuade the Ottoman Empire. Please wait, Your Majesty. Despite having no certainty whatsoever, Palmerston made a promise without hesitation. Even if he couldn't keep it, what could Greece do? Moreover, by then the Ottoman Empire's army would already be mobilized, and Greece would miss its best opportunity to do whatever it wanted. Palmerston didn't believe that Greece's hastily assembled army could defeat the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legions. Of course, he also issued a warning, if Greece takes any unilateral actions to disrupt the peace before then, the British Royal Navy will stand by and watch. After saying this, Palmerston stared intently at Otto, his eyes filled with warning. Their eyes met, and after a long while, Otto slowly spoke, out of trust in Britain, I am willing to give the Ottoman Empire one last chance. But if the Ottoman Empire still does not correct their attitude by then, I will lead the Greek army to settle the centuries-old feud with the Ottomans. Palmerston, of course, knew that the so-called centuries-old feud referred to the Ottoman Empire's destruction of the Byzantine Empire, but he was not worried at all. As a longtime friend of Greece, I have always witnessed His Majesty's efforts in maintaining the friendship between Britain and Greece, which has always been unbreakable. If Mahmud I remains obstinate, Britain will actively stand on Greece's side and mediate with the Ottoman Empire. In Palmerston's view, as long as Russia does not intervene, even if Egypt and Greece send troops together, it will only cause some trouble at most. The Greek army is so strong that it would be difficult for them to even defeat the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legions in the Balkans. Russia's finances are already strained, limiting its ability to wage large-scale war. Furthermore, Britain has contingency plans in place, ensuring that Russia won't have the time to intervene in the Near East war before the Ottomans' victory in Syria. Sometimes, it's the lessons learned that make people more obedient. Now, my advice to Greece is actually beneficial. If Otto remains stubborn, let him suffer the consequences first. Ultimately, Neither Mahmud I nor Palmerston truly believed that Greece, a small country that had only recently gained independence, could pose a real threat to the Ottoman Empire. Britain's real concern was that the Ottoman Empire, distracted by its war with Egypt, would be further distracted by Greece's meddling in the chaos, fueling Russian ambitions and giving Russia an opportunity to expand its influence in the Near East. If the Ottoman Empire could hold off the Russians, it was quite confident of defeating Egypt. Palmerston did not believe the Greek army could withstand the Ottoman Empire's new army. After all, no matter how well Greece developed, it could not change the fact that it was a small country, and small countries ultimately had to submit to the will of the great powers. After seeing Palmerston off, Otto's expression remained serious, but in reality, he wasn't angered by the implicit contempt for Greece in Palmerston's attitude. His earlier display of anger towards Palmerston, stemming from Mahmud I's disdainful attitude, was largely an act. As long as Greece remained a small country and didn't become a great power, nothing would change. The only way to change this situation was to truly strengthen the nation he represented, making it a great power. This was what he was currently striving for, and the real reason he had made this high-stakes gamble. If this succeeds, Greece's path forward, while not guaranteed to be smooth, will certainly be more confident, with more options and room for maneuver. In recent years, Greece's fiscal revenue has been steadily increasing, but the massive expenditures of the 5-year plan have left Greece with little fiscal surplus. Furthermore, because Greece's domestic bourgeoisie is relatively weak, without Otto, there are few truly large capitalists. Otto estimates that the royal consortium will have to bear more than 100 million drachmas of debt. However, considering the crucial nature of this battle, Otto was going all out. The Greek government halted many construction projects in its 5-year plan. He not only had all the gold reserves in the royal bank cast into drachmas, but he was also prepared to use a large sum of money he had just acquired. Chapter 102 Hindu Temples. 2 months earlier, Tuniska, an intelligence agent for Otto's department, looked up at the sky. He never imagined that while he was enjoying the sunshine in the kingdom of the two Sicilies, he would now be in India. His group, disguised as an expedition, was currently staying in a small village called Demiru near the temple. Before receiving the orders, Tuniska had no idea that this mission would be to India. However, since it was a mission personally arranged by His Majesty Otto, he needed to give it his all. After receiving the orders, he diligently studied the local situation and even learned some local phrases. To avoid drawing too much attention, their group of over 30 people wasn't all there. They were divided into 2 groups, one disguised as an expedition team and the other as a caravan. Tuniska was assigned to guard the expedition, and they were now awaiting the arrival of the caravan. Upon arrival, Tuniska conducted a detailed investigation of their target, the Padmanabhaswamy Hindu temple, built in the 16th century by order of the king of the Travancore Kingdom, a princely state of India. Since its completion, the temple had been a popular pilgrimage site, and although the number of worshippers had decreased somewhat in recent years, it remained quite popular. Therefore, they could only enter the temple at night. As initially agreed, the caravan would arrive the following evening, and tonight they would scout ahead. Looking at the sky, Tuniska gathered his men and began assigning tasks. After nightfall, the group slipped past the villagers and stealthily made their way to the temple. The figures, dressed in dark clothing, approached the temple quietly, evading the lazy monks on patrol, and slipped inside unnoticed. Padmanabhaswamy temple was vast, with many buildings unconnected. The 2 who had infiltrated had already identified their target. Passing through 2 buildings, they stopped in front of a somewhat dilapidated one. "This is it," one of them whispered. "Let's be careful." With that, the 2 cautiously entered, carefully observing the area, confirming that apart from the densely carved statues, there were no guards. Bang, 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 the 2 men kept banging along the wall, finally noticing some unusual sounds. After a brief discussion, they worked together to pry open the bricks, discovering a hidden space behind them. "You watch outside, I'll go in and take a look," said a relatively thin man, before he crawled inside, only to find it empty. Both men were puzzled, but they pressed the bricks back in, cleaned up the marks, and moved on to the next spot. "Alright, what did everyone find?" As dawn approached, Tuniska asked the returning group. "Based on the terrain we scouted earlier, we found 2 empty secret chambers. Adding to the 4 we found before, there are a total of 6 secret chambers." "Very good, you can all go and rest." Confirming the situation matched his understanding, Tuniska nodded. "Also, Get the demolition team ready. Double-check the materials for the silent blast. There can't be any mishaps. Having given the orders, the following night, a group of over 70 people gathered outside the temple, along with more than 20 tarpaulins covered with canvas, all prepared to transport the spoils. Tuniska, armed, instructed the armed men to be vigilant, then assigned tasks to each of them. Todd, take your men and sneak in to subdue the temple guards. Remember to do it quietly, without making a sound. Send a signal after you've completed the mission. Kid, once you see the signal, immediately bring the carriage over. After giving instructions to everyone, they immediately began a final check before the operation. Hooks, crossbows, padlocks, ropes, and so on were all checked. Tuniska waved his hand. Start the operation. The temple was unusually quiet in the dead of night. Apart from a few patrolling monks, everyone else was resting. Most of these patrolling Indian monks weren't very diligent either. They were all listless and lacked energy, which was a characteristic of Indians when they worked. A patrolling monk was yawning when suddenly two hands reached out from behind and grabbed his neck. With a snap, the monk fell silently to the ground. Several figures appeared, carrying away his corpse, and silence quickly returned. This scene repeated throughout the temple. There were only about 30 people in the entire temple, most of whom died mysteriously. Two monks noticed the attackers and shouted, but by then, most had already been killed. These two quickly followed in their companions' footsteps, causing little disturbance. The temple grounds were vast, quite a distance from the surrounding villages, so the shouts of the two men went unnoticed. All right, let's go in. Upon receiving the signal, Tuniska led his men into the temple, instructing Todd and his men to continue the vigil to prevent any accidents. He then instructed the others, you few come with me to the 2 empty secret chambers. The rest of you open the other 4 secret chambers, load all the valuables onto the wagons, one by one. Once they're full, stop them at the main gate and transport them all together at the end. With all the monks settled, the group moved much more efficiently. Tuniska and his men quickly arrived at an empty secret chamber. Everyone, check carefully and see if there's anything unusual. After a search, someone quickly said, Captain, something's not right here. The people here were all highly skilled individuals selected by the intelligence department. Upon closer inspection, someone quickly noticed a small difference between a large boulder and the others in the chamber. Moving such a large boulder directly would be difficult, so Tuniska immediately called in someone skilled in demolition to blast it open, and then began searching other areas. A few minutes later, with a loud bang, the boulder was blasted into several pieces. The group moved the pieces aside, waited a while for oxygen to enter, and then entered. Upon entering, everyone was stunned. Mountains of gold jewelry were piled up, most notably a giant, nearly human-sized, gold-cast elephant. There were also numerous chests. Tuniska pried one open, revealing it filled with various gold coins. Suppressing his excitement, Tuniska took a breath and called out, all right, quickly call people in and move all this away. Although reluctant, Tuniska knew these things belonged to His Majesty Otto, but once they were transported back, they would surely receive a substantial reward. There were 6 secret chambers, each containing vast amounts of gold and silver coins and jewelry, causing the axles of the broad carriage to creak and groan. By dawn, Tuniska and his men, laden with their spoils, had already vanished, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. Chapter 103 The British Tactics. As dawn broke, pilgrims who had come to worship finally discovered the monk's body in the temple. News of this quickly spread, and as one of India's most famous temples, such a significant event was bound to alarm the local British. Initially, the British didn't pay much attention to an Indian temple. After all, they believed in God, and what did Indian temples have to do with them? But then someone reported that a secret chamber had been discovered in the temple, and that a few scattered gold coins had been found inside. This piqued the British's interest, and astute individuals quickly deduced that the temple's secret chamber contained treasure. They concluded that a group of thieves had committed this tragedy. Thinking of the 6 sizable secret rooms and the potential wealth hidden within, the British immediately sprang into action. Soon, under British surveillance, the expedition team, disguised as Tuniska and his group, who were lodging in a village near the temple, came into their sights. But by the time they continued their investigation, Tuniska and his team had already loaded their loot onto a prepared merchant ship, departed the Indian port, and embarked on their return journey. The treasure from the Hindu temple was a deeply etched part of Otto's memory. Its discovery had generated considerable buzz and discussion online. As one of the few treasures that Otto remembered and knew in detail, he had his eye on it for years. However, to ensure the operation's safety, the personnel involved not only needed to be highly skilled but also, crucially, trustworthy. This group tasked with seizing the temple treasure was personally selected by Otto, subjected to loyalty tests, and their families were all under his control. Otto only gathered them together before the operation was confirmed. Prior to that, most of them were strangers to each other, thus minimizing the possibility of collusion. It seems the operation, from the moment these people received the mission to its completion, took only 3 or 4 months, but Otto had been preparing for this day for 3 years. Gentlemen, congratulations on the successful completion of this mission. On behalf of His Majesty Otto and Greece, I thank you for your contributions. To show his respect, West was the one who received the returning group. He knew that mere verbal praise would not be enough to satisfy them, so he continued, all participants will receive a reward of 100,000 drachms, as well as a knighthood awarded by His Majesty, and your positions will be adjusted accordingly. To reward these people, Otto gave them ample money, honor, and future prospects. Even the 3 leaders would receive lifelong knighthoods. This was the first time Otto had bestowed noble titles within Greece. For people of that era, although it was only a lifelong title, it was still extremely valuable. Hearing of these rewards, everyone couldn't help but cheer. The wise knew that as long as they didn't make mistakes, they would surely be highly valued under Otto's rule. These people were carefully selected. For them, these rewards were far more important than mere money. To welcome you all, I have arranged a banquet. Champagne, delicious food, and beautiful women await you. After arranging for the guests to be entertained, West led his men to inventory and store the spoils, and then reported to Otto. Your Majesty, according to the tally, this haul includes 34 tons of gold, 346 kilograms of various gemstones, and 250 kilograms of diamonds, the largest of which weighs 67 carats. In addition, there are many agates and Indian Buddha statues. Looking at the long list in his hand and listening to West's introduction, Otto couldn't help but smile. This was indeed a windfall. If historical and cultural value is not considered, the treasure is worth 600 million drachms, but only about 400 million drachms can be used directly. The other jewels and diamonds need to be sold off little by little through the Royal Consortium's businesses, otherwise, selling them all at once would greatly reduce their prices. There are also items bearing Indian religious symbols that cannot be sold in the short term, as the massacre of the temple has caused a huge uproar in India, and rumors of hidden treasures have spread. Selling items with Indian religious characteristics at this time would be an admission of guilt. While the Royal Consortium has indeed been making a fortune in recent years, colonial development is also a huge expense, consuming nearly 70% of its annual profits. If it weren't for this windfall, Otto, who had almost exhausted his annual surplus on colonial development, wouldn't have had the confidence to directly subscribe to 100 million Delimac war bonds at the cabinet meeting. With ample funding secured, the Greek government mobilized quickly. Meanwhile, news from Spain further escalated the international situation. A coup has occurred in Spain. Regent Queen Christina has been ousted. The newly appointed regent declared that Christina was acting against the tide of history, issuing arbitrary orders, and subsequently overturned many of her policies. The most important statement was that Christina, for personal power, had sold Spain to the French. For the sake of Spanish independence, the marriage between Isabella II and the French Dauphin was null and void. Furthermore, Spain signed a mutual defense treaty with the British. When news of this decision spread, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and many other European countries expressed their support and even publicized it extensively. London newspapers even called it another great diplomatic victory for Britain. Shortly before this, with French assistance, the Spanish government forces crossed the French border to attack Carlos's forces. Although Carlos's remnants managed to hold out for 2 months in the jungle, utilizing the terrain, they were ultimately completely routed by the Spanish government forces. Carlos himself was forced into exile in Britain seeking asylum. The Carlos faction within Spain suffered a significant blow, making the prospect of reclaiming the Spanish throne seem increasingly distant. This was tantamount to Spain outmaneuvering the French. Otto had assumed the British would have no other way to deal with the Franco-Spanish marriage in the short term. However, the British, true to their word, used their methods flawlessly, finding a breakthrough directly with the Spanish government, leaving the French in a difficult position, a resounding victory. Upon receiving the news, King Louis Philippe of France was naturally furious, even threatening to send troops to Spain, but was dissuaded by his ministers. If France were to actually invade Spain, Spain would find it difficult to resist, but aside from Russia's stance, the British, Austria, and the Kingdom of Prussia would not allow it, as it would completely violate the original Vienna Agreement. It wasn't even impossible that Britain would then rally other European countries to form another anti-French coalition. After all, Napoleon had only been dead for a short time, and many of those who had fought in the war were still alive. They were all still wary of the French Empire that Napoleon had established, which had dominated all of Europe. Given this mindset, it wasn't difficult for the British to form an anti-French coalition. Otto estimated that the French would certainly not accept this, and of all the ways they could cause trouble for the British, the most effective was. Chapter 104 The Smell of Gunpowder Smoke. 1839, at the Royal Palace in Athens, Otto met with the British ambassador, Palmerston, again just 2 months later. Mr. Palmerston, I hope you bring good news this time. Your Majesty, please rest assured, Palmerston said confidently, King Mahmud II is already considering an alliance with Greece. With the two countries united, I believe that defeating the Egyptians and Greece reclaiming Crete will not be far off. Last time, Mahmud II rejected an alliance with Greece in front of Palmerston, but Palmerston knew he had better keep Greece on his side, otherwise Greece might be lured in by Russia. Although Britain had made some preparations, it's always good to have a backup plan. If the arrangements with Russia didn't work as expected, and Greece declared war on the Ottoman Empire again, the Ottoman army in the Balkans would face a pincer attack. The consequences of Russian incursions into the Balkans were something the British didn't want to see. Is Mahmud II really willing to join forces with us? Otto frowned. But I recently received news that the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legion of 60,000 men has basically completed its mobilization. Their target is not the Egyptians, but they are preparing to move south. He is not worried about the 100,000 Russian troops that are being mobilized on the border, but he is moving troops to a Greek border. I don't think this means he is willing to ally with us. The Principality of Moldavia is also the Ottoman territory that is currently closest to the Russians, and it is also the most suitable route for a large army to march. In the last Russo-Turkish War, Russia advanced all the way from here into the Balkans until it was forced to withdraw under pressure from various countries. It was not surprising that Nicholas I chose to march from this location again. The Ottoman Empire was prepared for this, having stationed 120,000 troops in the Principality of Moldavia to defend against the Russian Empire. I think the main reason is that Greece and the Ottomans lack sufficient trust in each other. Mahmud II is a little nervous about Your Majesty Otto's large-scale military expansion. I think that as long as Your Majesty Otto personally sends an envoy to discuss the matter with him and recognizes Your Majesty's sincerity, Mahmud II will agree to an alliance with Greece. As for the Russians, Palmerston thought for a moment and decided to reveal something to Otto. Don't be fooled by the apparent activity of their troops stationed on the border of the Principality of Moldavia. The Tsar will soon have no time to concern himself with matters in the Balkans. What is it that has made the Tsar put aside the campaign against the Ottomans? Otto asked, feigning curiosity. Privately, however, he knew that the Polish Restoration Army was about to make a move. In fact, not long ago, he had instructed his men to provide them with an extra batch of weapons and ammunition in the name of the French. According to his prediction, the Polish people would revolt again in a month or two at most. At that time, the Russian troops stationed on the border of the Principality of Moldavia would be the closest and most capable of suppressing the Polish uprising. When Otto inquired, Palmerston remained tight-lipped, saying, His Majesty will know the truth in 2 months at most. Otto feigned thought for a moment, then said, In that case, I'll send the foreign minister to Constantinople. I'll put him in charge of the negotiations with the Ottomans. Neither Otto nor Palmerston told the truth in this conversation, but their intentions were remarkably aligned, to delay as much as possible. Afterward, Palmerston didn't linger in Athens and went to the Ottoman Empire again. Since the signing of the agreement between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, relations between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire had become increasingly tense. Tensions were high between the two sides at the border, and a single misstep could escalate into full-blown conflict. Time was of the essence for Palmerston. He needed to discuss the matter of winning over the Greeks with Mahmud II in more detail, and in the meantime, he also obtained some authorizations within the country. To be honest, Palmerston was somewhat annoyed by the situation in the Ottoman Empire. The British had signed commercial contracts with the Ottoman Empire for two reasons: to gain access to the Ottoman market and to secure Egyptian cotton production. However, things did not develop as the British had anticipated. First, the Egyptians refused to accept these agreements, declaring that they did not recognize the treaties signed by the Ottoman Empire. Furthermore, while the Ottoman Empire's market was indeed substantial, following Britain's lead, envoys from various European countries flocked to the Ottoman Empire, seeking the same trade privileges as the British. At this point, prompted by a savvy individual, Mahmud II, having realized the situation, while secretly cursing the British for their cunning, readily agreed to these countries' requests, believing that the more debt, the less worries, as a result. Consequently, European merchants saw an opportunity and flocked to the Ottoman Empire to do business, even engaging in price wars and competition. This outcome was not what the British desired. While Britain's industrial level was indeed the world's best, it didn't mean other countries lacked their own competitive products. Faced with fierce competition and a brutal trade war among merchants from various countries, British merchants discovered that profits on most goods traded in the Ottoman Empire had dwindled to meager levels, making the anticipated high profits impossible. While the Ottoman Empire's own manufacturing sector was hit, increased imports and exports significantly boosted its tariff revenue, offering some consolation to Mahmud II. However, Mahmud II's joy was short-lived, as the Russians suddenly amassed a large army in the north. It's important to remember that in the previous Russo-Turkish War, the Russians gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. This meant that the Russians could easily use the pretext of unjust treatment of Orthodox Christians to launch a military campaign against the two principalities, without needing to find any other legitimate reason for war. Despite having a slightly larger force on its northern border, Mahmud II felt no reassurance in the face of the Russian army. All he could do was seek British assistance while simultaneously preparing his northern troops for defense, demonstrating his refusal to surrender easily and hoping to deter the Russians. Nicholas I merely laughed at the Ottoman Empire's response, ignoring the British warnings. He had long harbored resentment towards Britain due to its provocations over the years. Especially after Queen Victoria's accession, he considered the British army a cowardly, infantile force, unworthy of comparison to the Russian army, forged in the harsh winters and snows. The Russians' deployment of troops along the border also focused Mahmud II's attention on the north, making him even more hesitant to wage war against Egypt, fearing that the Russians might take advantage of the situation. As for the Greeks, although he had heard that the Greeks had expanded their army to over 100,000, Mahmud II was not worried at all. In his view, the Greeks, with a population of just over 1 million, had expanded their army to such a large extent that they had probably drawn the elderly and children into the ranks. No matter how large the army was, it would be nothing more than a rabble. Facing the Greeks who had once brought him humiliation, Mahmud II had no intention of allying with them, at most engaging in feigned cooperation at Palmerston's request. Regardless, the smell of gunpowder in the Near East is getting stronger and stronger. Chapter 105 Rainy Season, Seeking Monthly Votes and Subscriptions. In March, Central and Southern Africa is in the midst of the rainy season. Accompanied by rumbling thunder, dense raindrops arrive as expected. Africa, which had previously been in the dry season, a vast expanse of desert, seemingly stagnant like a pool of still water, is instantly revitalized. Rainwater, stored up for most of the year, pours out at this time, and life flourishes with its arrival. The plants on the earth don their new green coats. Wildebeest, antelopes, and other animals that were previously difficult to find on the grasslands suddenly appear out of nowhere. They chased after the lush aquatic plants in herds. Hippos frolicked wildly by the lake, their bodies completely submerged in the water. Crocodiles lay in wait, lurking beneath the surface, ready to trap their prey. For a time, Central and Southern Africa burst into vibrant life, but for the guards, advancing inland, this was not good news. Battalion Commander Algins of the 2nd Battalion kept directing his men to check supplies. Food and ammunition must be placed on top of the carts. Under no circumstances should they touch the ground and get wet. What's wrong with this tarpaulin? It's not secure at all. What if rainwater seeps in? I've emphasized this many times, strictly follow the training procedures. We still have a long way to go, and food and ammunition are the most important. The sudden downpour forced the 2nd Battalion to halt their march and find high ground to take shelter. After more than 10 days of marching, the morale of the entire unit had dropped considerably. It was necessary to calm the troops down. He looked around. The rain had lessened slightly, but it still hadn't stopped, and he didn't know when it would end. Time was still too tight, forcing the team to set off at an inopportune time. I didn't expect the rain to be so heavy this time. He glanced at the team, especially the more than 500 Chinese immigrants, who were all working in an orderly manner, and nodded in approval. He had originally heard that Qing dynasty people all had ugly braids, liked to smoke opium, and looked listless every day. But seeing the performance of the Chinese immigrants in the past 2 years had changed his preconceived notions. These people were diligent and honest, and their ability to endure hardship even surpassed that of most European immigrants. They were also extremely obedient to orders. No wonder His Majesty Otto brought a large number of Chinese to the Central and Southern African colonies, even though it was so far away. At this time, Chinese immigrants could be seen in most Greek colonial outposts in Central and Southern Africa. Although the number of Chinese in each outpost was small, their behavior gradually earned the respect of many European immigrants, and the colonial administrators gradually accepted them. It was rumored that after this wave of European immigration, more Chinese immigrants would be introduced to Central and Southern Africa, a prospect that all Chinese welcomed. Following last year's new orders, both the Congo colony and the Greek East African colonies were rapidly expanding, taking advantage of the large influx of European refugees. They had especially discovered that the highlands of East Africa were more suitable for human habitation, making them a key area for immigration. Over the past 6 months, more than 800,000 immigrants have arrived from Europe, with nearly 500,000 settling in the Greek East African colonies. The Royal Consortium has invested heavily in transporting these immigrants, utilizing all available ships and employing numerous Dutch and British merchant vessels. Even now, the colonial team continues to establish new settlements to accommodate these newcomers. Fortunately, this final wave of expansion and relocation has passed, and things will be relatively stable for now. The entire colony in Central and Southern Africa will now enter a period of development. The coast of Greek East Africa belongs to the Sultanate of Oman, centered around the port of Sanran, extending to the entire East African coast. Therefore, the Greek East African colonies were centered on New Athens, Dodoma, an inland region with a more pleasant climate, surrounded by 6 colonial outposts covering more than 3,000 square kilometers and housing a total of 40,000 immigrants. Expanding outwards from this core, a series of colonial outposts were established, with approximately 530,000 immigrants distributed across more than 200,000 square kilometers of land. Next year, with the arrival of new immigrants, the colonies will continue to expand. The demand for immigrants and land in the Central and Southern African colonies seems endless. According to past practice, in 2 months, the Janissaries stationed in the colonies will gather a group of men, along with recruited reserve militia, to conduct a sweeping purge of the indigenous tribes within their sphere of influence. The weapons were prepared in advance, and most of the prepared militia had received basic military training. Once the number of natives in the area decreased to a certain level, the guarding and patrolling of the immigrant settlements would gradually be handed over to these militia. The natives were not particularly difficult to deal with. Most of the stubborn ones were captured and traded to the Sultanate of Oman. The Sultanate of Oman had always been very keen on the slave and ivory trade. Originally, they had to organize manpower to painstakingly travel to the inland regions to obtain these goods, a laborious task with limited returns. After the arrival of the Greek colonial team, they began a large-scale roundup and expulsion of the local natives. Following Otto's orders, these captured tribal natives, aside from the able-bodied men who could be used as laborers, were to be disposed of, along with the women, the elderly, and children. Killing them outright would be a waste. The Portuguese in the Congo colony and the Sultanate of Oman in the Greek East African colony became the colony's largest trading partners. Now, the Zanzibars could simply sit at home and have large quantities of slaves and ivory delivered to their doorstep. The Sultanate of Oman no longer organized manpower to go inland. Instead, they operated as middlemen, selling these goods through Arab merchants, which ironically made the country appear increasingly prosperous. For the colonial forces, dealing with the indigenous tribes in the plains was relatively easy. The trouble lay in the fact that some natives, seeing they were outnumbered, would hide in the mountains and forests, playing hide and seek. At this point, the Imperial Guard could only watch these natives escape. The colonial administration repeatedly issued orders not to pursue fleeing natives deep into the mountains to avoid casualties. For these natives who had fled into the mountains, the colonial forces could only rely on the troops stationed at surrounding outposts to conduct occasional patrols and raids, capturing them when they were off guard and emerged from the mountains. Furthermore, apart from the core areas, the other outposts had smaller populations and covered a vast area, inevitably resulting in many natives escaping. Therefore, clearing the native population from the colonial-controlled areas became a long-term task. Basically, there is a large-scale sweep every year, and the various colonial settlements also conduct continuous patrols around their settlements. It is estimated that it will take until the colonial settlements continue to develop and the population within their area increases before these indigenous people can be gradually cleared out. Chapter 106 Gaps. Compared to the Greek East African colonies, the coastal areas of the Congo colony had already expelled almost all the indigenous people. Except for a few retained for heavy manual labor, the rest were sent to the American South or sold to Portuguese slave traders. Due to the large influx of immigrants, the scale of food cultivation increased significantly this year, with new farmland being designated around many settlements. Most of the colony settlements were built along rivers, ensuring a stable supply of produce and food, eliminating reliance on the weather. Because of its proximity to the Atlantic Ocean and the hot, humid climate, rice was grown in many parts of the coastal areas, while wheat was better suited to the highlands of Greek East Africa. Currently, sisal and cotton are the colony's main economic crops. In addition, bananas and cocoa beans are cultivated, and cloves are also grown in considerable quantities in Greek East Africa. The area is naturally suited to clove cultivation. The former Sultanate of Oman was renowned for its clove production, so the colonial team couldn't resist. Thanks to livestock brought in from within the country this year, livestock-based farming has begun to appear in the Central and Southern African colonies, gradually reducing reliance on indigenous labor in agriculture. Horses have also increased communication efficiency between colonial outposts. With virtually no infrastructure in the East African colonies, communication in many places relied solely on foot. Messages that previously took 1 or 2 months to arrive now take only 1 or 2 weeks with horses, significantly enhancing the management's control over the various colonies. Horses have also made colonial exploration and patrols around the outposts much more efficient. Horse-drawn plows were prevalent in Europe, and horses were essential agricultural tools. Many European immigrants were originally farmers and were quite adept at raising horses. Consequently, the importance of cattle in Europe decreased, and they gradually became a staple food. Europeans gradually developed a habit of eating beef and drinking milk, raising cattle primarily for consumption. Over time, this led to the development of many cattle breeds better suited for human consumption. In fact, food choices were also related to the relatively low level of European food processing techniques. For example, Europeans did not know how to castrate boars, resulting in pork with a strong, pungent flavor. Once this habit was formed, even in the future, the proportion of pork consumed by Europeans remained relatively small, especially among the aristocracy. Conversely, beef, requiring only simple preparation, tasted quite good and was naturally more popular with Europeans. In the Central and Southern African colonies, due to the habits of the predominantly European immigrants, Otto naturally opted for horse-drawn plows, and the cattle and sheep transported were primarily for raising and raising for meat. At this time, smoke could already be seen rising from chimneys along the coast, and the farm canteens had begun cooking. The nearby fields had almost been plowed, and using water wheels, the immigrants could easily pump river water into the rice paddies. These paddy fields were quite large, and horses began to be used for tilling. Of course, the indigenous people remained an important source of labor, as the number of horses was still somewhat insufficient. The Central and Southern African colonies were peaceful, with everyone contributing to the colony's development, building houses, developing farmland, constructing irrigation canals, planning and building roads, and raising livestock. Agricultural civilization was beginning to take flight in Central and Southern Africa. Conversely, the Near East was increasingly engulfed in conflict. Palmerston breathed a sigh of relief. He found these Polish restoration troops annoying. They clearly lacked ability but had enormous appetites and ever-increasing demands. If these people really took the money but didn't do anything, he would definitely make them understand that the British Empire would not tolerate deception. After bidding farewell to the Polish people, Palmerston returned to Istanbul. This time, he wanted to continue trying to persuade Mahmud II to cooperate with the Greeks, at least temporarily appeasing them with some conditions. Palmerston was relatively confident in the Ottoman Empire's victory over Egypt. The Ottoman Empire's military reforms in recent years had already shown initial results, boasting a modern army of over 200,000. In contrast, Egypt's entire army numbered only 170,000, with only about half being modern troops. Because Muhammad Ali consistently employed a policy of oppressive rule, the Egyptian-controlled Arabian Peninsula region remained unstable, requiring a large military presence to prevent rebellions. Consequently, Egypt's troop strength was far inferior to that of the Ottoman Empire, meaning the Ottomans would only need to spend a little more time to defeat Egypt. Currently, the British Mediterranean Fleet is also stationed at its base in the Ionian Islands, closely monitoring the Greeks should Otto become impatient and declare war on the Ottoman Empire. The British fleet could immediately blockade trade along the Greek coast, forcing Greece to concede. Simultaneously, the British Mediterranean Fleet has another mission, to work with the Ottoman Navy to first destroy the Egyptian Navy. Muhammad Ali had been building warships for years, a fact well known to British spies. Palmerston believed the British Navy would teach him that naval warfare wasn't simply a matter of having more ships. According to the agreement between Britain and Greece, although Greece had reclaimed the Ionian Islands, the British Navy could maintain a presence there whenever needed. The Greeks hadn't caused the British Navy any trouble, further reassuring Palmerston and making him more confident that Greece would heed his advice. Otherwise, a mere British blockade of the entire eastern Mediterranean would have severely damaged the Greek economy. While the Greek Navy had indeed expanded rapidly in recent years, it lacked combat experience and was simply no match for the British Navy. A complete blockade of Greek foreign trade would cripple the Greek economy, and Palmerston believed Otto couldn't possibly be unaware of this. He was confident that Greece would have no choice but to submit to Britain's arrangements and swallow the bitter pill. As a prominent figure of the era, Palmerston possessed a keen understanding of the situation in the Near East, aiming not only to bring Egyptian cotton to Britain but also to prevent Russia's continued expansion into the Balkans, thus contributing to the enduring legacy of the British Empire. The leaders of the Polish Reconquista were now extremely excited. The natural disasters of the previous year had devastated the people of Poland. The brutal Russians not only failed to provide aid but also took the opportunity to raise taxes, causing widespread resentment among the Polish people and many Polish nobles. Previously, these local nobles had only offered tacit support to the Polish Reconquista, taking no concrete action for fear of angering the Russians. The Polish nobles implicated in the Warsaw Uprising had suffered terribly, losing their land and livelihoods, leaving them with lingering fear. But this latest incident, with many having suffered significant losses, deepened their hatred for the Russians. Many Polish nobles believed that without overthrowing Russian rule, their lives would never be good, and their enthusiasm for assisting the Polish Restoration Army greatly increased. With their covert help, the Polish Restoration Army recruited men and gathered intelligence much more smoothly. Furthermore, with the French and British providing substantial amounts of weaponry, supplies, and funds, another uprising could finally be planned. This time, they were better prepared, possessed a larger and more well-equipped army, and were confident they could demonstrate the strength of the Polish people to the cold-blooded and brutal Nicholas I, thus restoring Poland's independence. Chapter 107 Declaration of War. 1839, the Polish Restoration Army launched another uprising. The sudden insurgents swiftly annihilated the 2,000 Russian troops stationed in Warsaw and captured the city. Upon receiving the news, the Russian troops stationed in Poland reported to St. Petersburg while simultaneously mobilizing 30,000 troops stationed near Warsaw to march on the city and quell the rebellion. However, en route, they were ambushed by thousands of Polish insurgents equipped with modern assault rifles and even 8 light artillery pieces. The Russian troops, who were on their march, were suddenly ambushed and thrown into chaos. Although the commander acted decisively and managed to stabilize a portion of the Russian army, he was forced to retreat due to the already scattered and disorderly ranks. In this battle, the Polish insurgents annihilated 5,000 Russian troops, crushing the largest Russian garrison near Warsaw and successfully thwarting Russia's plan to quickly quell the Polish uprising. Upon receiving the latest news, Nicholas I was furious. Determined to teach these restless Poles a bloody lesson, he immediately ordered the mobilization of 50,000 troops from the nearest border in Moldavia to suppress the rebellion in Warsaw. Palmerston, relieved to learn of the Polish uprising and the large-scale redeployment of Russian troops from the border, was also relieved. Simultaneously, under his arrangement, another war began in Central Asia. Britain was about to invade Afghanistan, completely blocking Russia's southward expansion to control access to the sea. This meant that Russia would have to contend with Austria and Prussia for the German territories, thus maintaining the balance of power on the European continent. A triumphant Palmerston arrived in Istanbul, urging Mahmud I to seize the opportunity to eliminate Egypt as a threat from the rear. As for the Greeks, he assured Otto that, as long as the Russians were preoccupied, they wouldn't dare act rashly. Upon seeing the latest intelligence, Mahmud I in the Grand Salakari Palace finally breathed a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, news from Egypt presented him with an opportunity. It seemed unrest had broken out within Egypt, and to quell the rebellion, the Egyptians had mobilized their troops stationed in Syria, leaving the Syrian army with only 30,000 men. In contrast, the Ottoman Empire had stationed 100,000 troops in Asia Minor and along the Syrian border, with an additional 80,000 troops in Istanbul ready to reinforce at any time. Furthermore, with a Russian withdrawal, Mahmud I had ordered the rapid deployment of 50,000 troops from Moldova to Asia Minor by sea. Having calculated his forces, Mahmud I felt the situation was extremely favorable, the advantage was in his hands, and he resolved to invade Syria, amassing 230,000 troops to completely annihilate Egypt and avenge his previous defeat. Just as he was about to launch his plan, Moltke the Elder, the military advisor to the Ottoman Empire, poured cold water on his vision. "Your Majesty, your army is not yet fully trained. At this point, it doesn't even reach the level of a third-rate European force. It will take time to transform them into a truly elite force." Moltke's assessment of the Ottoman army greatly displeased Mahmud I. The elder seemed to possess a quintessential European arrogance, and his pent-up resentment led him to make a firm decision. "How long have you been in charge of training my army?" Mahmud I asked. 3 years, Moltke the elder replied crisply. 3 whole years have passed, yet you still haven't been able to train a qualified new army. You are dismissed. Mahmud I's words were full of doubt about Moltke's abilities. Moltke's response was to turn around and leave the palace, leaving behind only one sentence that still echoed in the Grand Salakari Palace: "You will lose everything." Enraged by this, Mahmud I wanted nothing more than to order the man's execution. Mahmud I hadn't read the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, otherwise, he would have realized that his performance at this moment was similar to that of Yuan Shao before the Battle of Guandu. Mahmud I now only wanted his army to crush the Egyptian forces, storm Cairo, capture the traitor Muhammad Ali, and hang his head on the minaret of the palace, making it clear to everyone that the dignity of the Ottoman Empire was inviolable. On April 2, 1839, under the Sultan's orders, the Ottoman army crossed the Euphrates River and marched towards Egyptian-controlled Syria. Simultaneously, under Mahmud I's orders, troops in Istanbul and the main force transferred from the northern front also entered Asia Minor, ready to support the vanguard. On April 5, 1839, following Otto's orders, the foreign minister in Constantinople, Istanbul, also received news of the Ottoman Empire's military advance. While relaying this latest information back home, he went to the Grand Salakari Palace and said to Mahmud I, "Your Excellency, I have heard that you have sent troops to Syria. Before this, I had received no prior notice. Your actions have made Greece doubt your sincerity in allying with Greece against the Egyptians." Mahmud I's negotiations with the Greeks were merely a formality at the behest of the British. He himself only wanted to delay and prevent Greece from disrupting his rear while the Russians were advancing. He had never taken the Greeks seriously, especially since the British fleet had already joined forces with the Ottoman fleet, preparing to destroy the Egyptian navy. Feeling certain of victory, Mahmud I decided there was no need to continue placating the Greeks. Faced with their blunt questioning, and already seething with anger, he retorted without hesitation, "Have the Greeks forgotten the moment 400 years ago when they humbly begged for their lives before the Ottoman army? Your so-called independence is nothing but a cowardly existence under the leniency of the Ottoman Empire and with the help of other nations. The dignity of the Ottoman Empire is not something the Greeks can challenge." The foreign minister, who had already received secret orders from within the country, couldn't help but feel genuinely enraged upon hearing this, raising his voice in response, "Your Excellency, your words are an insult to Greece. If you do not retract them now, the Ottoman Empire will face the wrath of the Greek army." "The Greek army?" Mahmud I chuckled. 400 years. Have the weak Greeks suddenly developed some backbone? In that case, on behalf of Greece, I hereby formally declare war on the Ottoman Empire. Your Excellency will pay the price for your words. Having declared war, The foreign minister left the Grand Salario Palace without looking back. He needed to relay the news back home as quickly as possible. Greece's long-awaited opportunity had finally arrived. Whether or not Greater Greece could be rebuilt depended on this upcoming battle. Chapter 108 Guerrilla. It's time. Gather all the reservists on the farm, open the warehouses, and inventory the guns and ammunition. It's time for us to show our skills. At this moment, on a large farm in Bulgaria, on the Balkan Peninsula, Karjanis, responsible for training the farm laborers, shouted excitedly. Karjanis was originally just an ordinary soldier in the Greek Guards, but through his outstanding performance in the army, he won the opportunity to study at a military academy and became an officer in the Guards. Because Greece was constantly expanding its officer corps, official positions in the Praetorian Guard were scarce. The Praetorian Guard offered two options. One was to hold a nominal officer position with the same benefits but without a corresponding post, and the other was to be assigned to a large farm for reserve training, still considered a Praetorian Guard officer. After careful consideration, Karjanis chose to be assigned to the farm for reserve training and became the head of the farm's guard. Upon arriving, Karjanis gradually discovered some secrets of the farm. The farm laborers were ordinary people who had suffered oppression under the Ottoman Empire and were dissatisfied with its rule. The farm provided them with work and also educated them in Greek culture, spreading the idea that they were all once Romans. At the same time, the agricultural company's training requirements for these farm laborers as reserve soldiers were extremely strict, almost comparable to those of a regular army. Although much of the equipment provided was second-hand, it was all in good condition, not affecting training or use at all. The training ammunition was plentiful, allowing these reservists to receive thorough training. While their strength might not match that of the regular army, it far surpassed that of the local security forces in many parts of Ottoman territory. This led Karjanis to speculate that these large farms established in the Balkans served a deeper purpose than simply producing crops to supply the domestic food supply. Sure enough, his latest order instructed him to gather the reservists from the farms, form guerrilla units, and operate behind Ottoman lines under the command of the Bulgarian military commander. This immediately excited Karjanis. As a Greek, he had always been a supporter of Pan-Hellenicism. His experience in the Guards led him to believe that Greece would inevitably go to war with the Ottoman Empire to reclaim the Balkans. The formation of a guerrilla force was clearly due to Greece's impending declaration of war against the Ottomans. The guerrillas' mission was to raid isolated Ottoman personnel or key warehouses behind enemy lines, disrupt supply transport, and confuse Ottoman military deployments, thus providing support to the frontline troops. According to orders, the guerrillas' achievements would also be counted as military merit. This meant that if Karjanis could achieve sufficient merit, he would have the opportunity to be promoted in the army, possibly even becoming a mid-level or high-ranking officer. At this time, in the Balkans, there were thousands of officers like Karjanis who had received orders, all of whom had received their commands in March. Long before the foreign minister declared war on the Ottomans, guerrilla groups in various regions had already assembled and begun operating behind Ottoman lines according to their missions. At this time, the Ottoman Empire's regular army in the Balkans consisted of only 60,000 men from the 12 legions and the Macedonian legion along the Moldova and Dobroga regions, with the remainder being mainly city security forces. The Macedonian legion had by this time been deployed to the vicinity of Greece, leaving the Ottoman forces in the Balkans extremely weak and creating highly favorable conditions for guerrilla operations. Soon after, the Ottoman local government received reports of rebel armies attacking villages, killing landowners, and looting. Due to the Ottoman Empire's brutal rule, uprisings frequently occurred in many areas. These uprisings varied in size, mostly consisting of only a few dozen or even a dozen men, and primarily used melee weapons or even hoes and clubs, which could be easily suppressed by local security forces. However, the uprising armies appearing now were not only well-equipped but also numerous, and they were scattered throughout various locations, attacking villages and towns. At first, the Ottoman local officials didn't take it seriously, simply sending out their security forces to suppress the rebels, based on past experience. However, when the security forces set out, the rebels would regroup and ambush them. The security forces initially thought they were dealing with peasants who had just taken up arms and were struggling to get enough to eat. But after the battle began, they suddenly discovered that the enemy's weapons were superior and their troops were well trained, resulting in a significant loss for them. The Ottoman security forces were already limited in number, and after this defeat, Their numbers were further diminished. They no longer had the resources to send troops out to their deaths, and could only allow the rebels to roam freely outside the city, displaying their power and prestige. These so-called insurgent armies were actually guerrilla units that had been organized and were now in action. They operated within Ottoman territory, constantly attacking predetermined targets. The targets, as indicated by data collected over the years, were primarily landowners and wealthy merchants who supported Ottoman rule, as well as some ethnic separatists in the Balkans. The Ottomans, especially, were unable to suppress all the more hardline separatists, and could only manage to appease them. These individuals were predominantly from Serbia and Bulgaria. They were local landowners, nobles, wealthy merchants, and some scholars. They preferred to establish their own state, primarily composed of local people, with power held by themselves, rather than being ruled by others. Even though these people now oppose Ottoman rule as much as the Greeks, they will become obstacles to Greek control of these regions in the future. Eliminating these potential threats amidst the chaos of war is a predetermined Greek strategy. On April 8, 1839, news arrived from Istanbul that the foreign minister had declared war on the Ottoman Empire on behalf of Greece. Otto immediately ordered, "Someone, go and inform the cabinet to convene a meeting." Since the Ottoman Empire had directly presented its reasons, Otto did not hesitate any longer. He directly instructed the military to make final preparations and launch the attack. Otto participated in the formulation of the general plan, but he did not intend to interfere in this specific command. After years of rigorous training, the Greek army had encountered few formidable opponents. Aside from the indigenous peoples of Central and Southern Africa, this war with the Ottoman Empire was the test of their prowess. In this battle, the Greek army held an advantage in terms of numbers, training, and weaponry. The Greek regular army now widely uses the Type 37 rifle, a relatively new breech-loading weapon. While breech-loading rifles had existed for some time, they were expensive and suffered from serious gas tightness issues. Currently, the army primarily uses black powder, which produces a large amount of residue after each shot. If not properly cleaned, a typical breech-loading rifle will leak its chamber after 3 or 4 shots, spraying residual black powder onto soldiers' faces, and in severe cases, even causing a barrel explosion. Insufficient sealing also results in poor propulsion. Even with increased gunpowder, the lethality of a typical breech-loading rifle is only about 1/3 that of a conventional rifle, a significant reduction in firepower. The Type 37 rifle, developed under Otto's influence, can be considered the first practical breech-loading rifle of its time that could be deployed in actual combat. It solved the most critical sealing problem, and after improvements, cleaning became much easier, greatly reducing the danger while increasing power. Crucially, the price wasn't much different from a muzzle-loading rifle. In terms of artillery, the Greek army adopted French artillery technology, and in addition to its standard artillery configuration, it specifically formed 3 artillery regiments to enhance firepower. In contrast, although the Ottoman Empire had formed a modern army, the rifles and artillery used by its soldiers were inferior to those of the Greeks. The Macedonian legions that Greece would face this time consisted of only 10,000 men organized to modern standards. The rest were still using old-fashioned muskets and even melee weapons. Mahmud I initiated military reforms, but the corrupt bureaucracy of the Ottoman Empire consistently hindered progress. According to intelligence gathered by Otto, corruption and embezzlement were rampant within the Ottoman army. It is likely that only Mahmud I of the entire Ottoman Empire was unaware that nearly a quarter of his supposedly 400,000 strong army existed only on paper. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 109. Never resist the Tsar. Are the government departments ready? Otto asked bluntly after all the ministers had arrived and the meeting had begun. Sanos replied without hesitation, "Your Majesty, we have completed all preparations according to plan. Greece is ready to enter a state of war at any time, and all factories within the country are under government supervision. Our military supplies are sufficient for a year's use, and we have also prepared 100 million drachmas for war expenses. However, some construction projects under the 5-year plan have had to be suspended or postponed." Otto nodded in satisfaction and looked at Corinth. The 5-year plan construction projects can be postponed for a few more years. This war is crucial to us. Let the army move out. By the time the British react, the Navy will likely have difficulty leaving port. Your Majesty, please rest assured, the army at the front has reached its designated location on the border and is awaiting orders. Our Army and Navy have conducted numerous simulations and exercises for this military operation, and we are confident we can launch a surprise attack and deliver a heavy blow to the Ottomans, Corinth said without hesitation. Our troops are now awaiting orders and can be deployed at any time. Results will be available within 7 days at most, at which point the Ottomans will truly understand what it means to be caught between a rock and a hard place. According to the military's operational plan, this war against the Ottomans will not last more than 5 months. At that point, the Greek army might even advance into Thrace, threatening Istanbul and forcing the Ottomans to submit. Otto wisely refrained from interfering with the specifics of the battle plan. He knew his own limitations, he was primarily a theorist, and his strategic planning was only so-so. If the battle were to proceed entirely according to his ideas, the final outcome would likely be comparable to the duo of Carlos and Morazan, whom he had previously mocked. As for the Greek military's command capabilities, Otto wasn't entirely sure, but at least these men had received comprehensive training in their respective fields and possessed practical experience leading troops in battle, albeit against African natives. Since war has been declared, let's begin. According to intelligence, the Ottoman Macedonian Legion has already begun its southward advance. Your main force must first annihilate them, while the other departments must provide full support. Otto smiled and said, "Don't forget our strategic objective in this war. Defeating the Ottoman army is not the ultimate goal. All actions must revolve around the objective of occupying the Balkan Peninsula." "Yes, Your Majesty," Corinth replied firmly. With the order issued, Greece's war system immediately began to operate. At this time, the benefits of investing heavily in infrastructure construction became apparent. The mobilization of supplies and personnel from all over the country was orderly and far more efficient than anyone had anticipated. Following orders, the Greek Navy, along with a large number of transport ships, sailed out of the harbor under cover of night and disappeared into the Mediterranean darkness. In the industrial zone of Greece, Lucullus worked overtime, somewhat dejected, because his application to enlist had been rejected once again. Even though he was married and a father of 3, Lucullus had still signed up. Unfortunately, not only him, but all the workers in the machine shop were excluded from the conscription. Even if they applied, they would be rejected. Because the machine shop was a key industrial enterprise, it had been brought under government control and was supervised by personnel sent by the Greek government to ensure that the production of weapons, ammunition, and military supplies would not encounter problems. Every Greek dreamed of a greater Greece, and Lucullus was no exception. As a native Greek, defeating the Ottomans, reclaiming Greek lands, and establishing a truly greater Greece had always been his dream. In this respect, Otto's patriotic education was quite successful. The key factor was the brutal oppression suffered by the lower classes of Greece for centuries. Although the upper classes of Greeks lived comfortably under Ottoman policies for hundreds of years, the lower classes still had to endure various exorbitant taxes and levies from the Ottoman Empire, leading extremely impoverished lives. Especially during the Greek Wars of Independence, the Ottomans massacred the Greeks, and Lurus's grandparents and father all perished in the turmoil. Therefore, despite knowing the Ottoman Empire was stronger than Greece, Lurus still resolutely wanted to join the army and avenge his family. Furthermore, the Greeks had unwavering faith in King Otto. Since becoming king, Otto had instilled unity and hope in the Greeks. Seeing their lives improve and Greece grow stronger, all Greeks believed that since His Majesty Otto had made his decision, as long as they followed him, they would surely defeat the Ottomans. Otto himself probably didn't realize that the confidence of the Greek people, especially in him as king, was far stronger than that of the government, and even stronger than his own. This was partly due to Greece's current reserve force program, where every adult Greek man participates in military training annually to maintain readiness for combat. This has gradually fostered a military tradition in Greece, with many saying, "A life without battlefield experience is an incomplete life." At this time, government officials visiting the factory worked with the workers one by one to reassure them, encouraging them to focus on production and fulfill their tasks, thus contributing to Greek victory. Regardless, the work still needs to be done well, especially since many of their responsibilities involve military production. Mistakes are unacceptable. Greece's declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire truly surprised many countries. Even Nicholas I hadn't expected that Otto, who is always so cunning, would declare war on the Ottomans before Russia could make its move. This surprised Nicholas I didn't expect that Otto, this cunning fox-like fellow, would actually have some backbone. He truly is worthy of being the husband I personally chose for Adini, Alexandra's nickname. He's reliable in crucial moments. How is the situation in Poland now? Nicholas I asked the Minister of War. Our reinforcements have now entered the rebel-controlled area, but these rebels are not engaging us in direct combat, they are using the terrain to wage guerrilla warfare. Although their petty actions cannot harm the great Russian army, they are hindering the army's march. They are like rats, only able to hide in the shadows. Tell the army not to hesitate. Anyone who might be involved with the rebels should be executed on the spot. I am fed up with the Polish people, this time. The Polish problem must be completely resolved. Nicholas I issued the order coldly, now somewhat impatient. A sudden Polish uprising forced Nicholas I to divert troops from the front lines to quell the rebellion, potentially causing him to miss the best opportunity to attack the Ottoman Empire. However, with Greece now declaring war, the Ottomans, fighting on two fronts, could not possibly end the war quickly, leaving their borders vulnerable. If Russia could quell the Polish rebellion as soon as possible, there was a significant chance of advancing into the Balkans, and even cooperating with the Greeks to directly conquer Constantinople. In the last war with the Ottoman Empire, Russian troops had approached Constantinople, but the British, allied with France, Austria, and Prussia, forced Nicholas I to temporarily withdraw. Now, with Britain and France at odds, this presented Russia with its best opportunity. Thinking of this, Nicholas I couldn't help but issue another order, instructing the counterinsurgency forces to quickly annihilate the Polish Restoration Army in Warsaw, and simultaneously deciding to transfer more troops from within the country to the Polish front. This time, Nicholas I vowed in his heart to teach the Polish people a lesson they would never forget, so that they would never rebel against the Tsar. Chapter 110 Eat. Upon receiving news of Greece's declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire, especially given Mahmud I's arrogant attitude, Palmerston was filled with rage. If not for his remaining rationality, he might have even berated the Sultan. Palmerston's original plan was to win over the Greeks to fight Egypt, which would have increased the chances of success, shorten the war, and reduce the possibility of Russian intervention. However, Mahmud I's contempt for Greece and past grievances led him to reject this most advantageous option for the Ottoman Empire. This further enraged the Greeks, leading to a direct declaration of war. The Ottoman Empire had to bear the consequences of fighting on two fronts, giving Palmerston a feeling of "it's not that I'm not trying, but my teammates are always holding me back." Palmerston now knew that anger was useless. The only solution he could think of was to go to Athens now and persuade the Greeks to cease hostilities. If Otto insisted on continuing the war with the Ottoman Empire, he would instruct the Mediterranean fleet to blockade the eastern Mediterranean, forcing the Greeks to submit. Of course, since the number of British fleets deployed in the Mediterranean was limited, it would be best to have the British and Ottoman navies destroy the Egyptian navy together beforehand. However, Palmerston found himself in a predicament when, before he could even set off, he received news that the Greek navy had suddenly disappeared. This immediately alerted him to something amiss. He knew Greece was plotting something. This unexpected turn of events made Palmerston feel that things were out of his control. He quickly deduced that Greece's declaration of war against the Ottomans had been long in the making. Perhaps Greece already had two war plans, one for the Ottoman Empire and one for Egypt, especially since the Ottomans had directly refused to cooperate, making the Ottoman Empire their natural target. Palmerston believed his guess was likely true, but faced with Greece's declaration of war, he could only instruct that any news related to the Greeks be delivered to him immediately, while hoping for an Ottoman victory in Syria. If the Ottomans could thwart Greece's first wave of attacks, he would intervene immediately to bring Greece to a halt and back on track. Although he knew Greece had expanded its army to over 100,000 for this war, Palmerston was confident that the Ottoman army would have the upper hand, based on the disparity in national strength. On the Greek side, after the cabinet meeting concluded, General Corinth, the commander-in-chief of the war, arrived in Larissa, a city in northern Greece, by train. Upon disembarking, escorted by soldiers, Corinth arrived at the command headquarters meeting room. The officers, who had been sitting upright, all stood up abruptly. Corinth took the head seat, surveyed the key officers present, and waved for them to sit down. Currently, We have a total of 110,000 troops concentrated in Thessaly, mainly distributed in these 3 locations according to the plan. Commanding an army of over 100,000, it's impossible to have all troops moving together. The 4 divisions currently concentrated at the front, along with the independent artillery regiment and engineers, are deployed along the border of Thessaly region as planned. Very good. Then tomorrow morning, all troops will begin their northward march as planned. Colin issued the order without hesitation. We don't have much time. Long before the declaration of war, Greece had already begun preparations. The mobilization of soldiers, coordination of logistical supplies, medical supplies, etc., had been completed several days prior, and all troops were eager for battle. Having received orders, the army ate breakfast early the next morning and began their march. In the northern Greek mountains, long columns of Greek troops could be seen advancing through the rugged terrain. The cavalry, tasked with scouting ahead, crossed the Akman River under cover of darkness. The spring water was relatively warm, but after crossing, everyone's clothes were soaked. They had to find a dry spot to tether their horses to trees and rest. The soldiers chose their places to sit and rest, while Mathis vigilantly observed his surroundings, but the heavy darkness concealed everything. Suddenly, a faint sound came from not far away. Mathis immediately bent down, hiding behind a rock, and stared intently in the direction from which the sound came. A moment later, a dark figure appeared. Mathis immediately gestured behind him. Enemy. Willie, who had been watching Mathis' movements, immediately alerted his companions. Soon, everyone had their weapons ready and carefully formed a battle line. Willie approached Mathis and, following the direction of his finger, immediately spotted several dark figures moving about. A sudden bang rang out, shattering the tranquility of the night, followed by a series of gunshots. Several figures fell instantly, but unable to confirm the enemy's situation in the darkness, Mathis and his men did not choose to advance rashly. Instead, they reloaded and kept a close watch on their surroundings. Sure enough, gunfire soon erupted from the opposite side as Greek and Ottoman reconnaissance forces clashed on the riverbank. Early the next morning, Corinth received news that his frontline reconnaissance units had encountered Ottoman Macedonian scouts at the Akman River. Corinth immediately ordered his troops to speed up their march. The main forces of both sides met south of Kazan, and immediately deployed their formations and began exchanging fire. On the first day of battle, both sides engaged in fierce artillery duels, followed by small-scale infantry barrages. General Corinth quickly realized that the enemy's forces were insufficient and their artillery was outnumbered, so he immediately ordered the 1st Division to launch a volley attack. The Greek troops, in high spirits, charged the Ottoman army. A fierce firefight quickly ensued, with gunfire ringing out and white smoke billowing across the battlefield. It seems the Ottomans have at most a little over 10,000 men on the front lines. Their rear guard appears weak as well. The intelligence seems accurate. The Macedonian legions on the other side are far fewer in number than expected, the military advisor said to Corinth, setting down his binoculars on a hillside. The Ottoman Empire thinks it can stop us with a Macedonian legion, but it doesn't realize that Greece today is vastly different from what it was during the War of Independence. They can't even solve their own problem of being starved. Recalling the intelligence about the Macedonian legion, Corinth asked, "Have you confirmed their artillery positions?" "Confirmed, Your Excellency," the adjutant replied after confirming the report. "Very well, in that case, we can begin." Through the previous exchange of fire and the intelligence gathered, General Corinth had confirmed the true nature of the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legion and immediately issued the order, aimed the artillery at the enemy's artillery positions behind the lines. "I want to silence all of the Ottoman cannons." "Yes, sir." With the order given, the Greek artillery unleashed its power once more. Based on the previous artillery battle, the Greek army had roughly pinpointed the location of the enemy's cannons. In an instant, the sound of exploding shells echoed continuously from the rear of the Ottoman army, and countless shells landed on the Ottoman artillery positions and the surrounding area. The Ottoman Empire's army had a long history of using heavy artillery, dating back to the reign of Mehmed I. At that time, the Ottoman army, using the urban cannon, breached the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Even the formidable walls of Constantinople, which were virtually impregnable in the era of cold weapons, could not withstand the barrage of artillery fire. From then on, the Ottoman army favored heavy artillery in combat. However, with Otto's substantial investment, the Greek army now held an advantage in both the caliber and quantity of heavy artillery. Furthermore, Their artillerymen had undergone more rigorous training, resulting in superior technology and accuracy. Soon, the Ottoman artillery positions were bombarded by Greek shells, destroying numerous cannons and causing countless artillery casualties, forcing them to cease fire and relocate urgently. At this point, Corinth issued a new order: the Ottomans currently have at most 40,000 men on the front lines. Have the artillery provide 3 rounds of preparation fire. The 1st Division should stop probing. After the bombardment ends, press forward directly. The cavalry regiments prepare for a surprise attack. I want to annihilate the Ottoman Macedonian Corps. Chapter 111. The Mad Sultan. The Royal Palace of Athens. Since the start of the war, despite countless mental rehearsals, Otto still couldn't maintain complete composure, barely managing to suppress the urge to issue orders to the front lines. He now understood why so many leaders, despite lacking military talent, preferred micromanagement. The feeling of being powerless to do anything but wait for results from the rear was simply too unpleasant. To prevent himself from being swayed by these emotions, Otto had to find other things to do. Otto planned to inspect the various parts of Greece, as wartime measures were being implemented for the first time in Greece, and problems were bound to arise. Early detection and rectification would be crucial. Your Majesty, General Corinth has sent a military report. We have completely annihilated the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legion south of Kozan. Just as Otto was planning his inspection route, the new report ignited his excitement. Really? Otto couldn't help but rush over, snatch the report, and quickly read it. A huge weight was finally lifted from his heart. The Macedonian army of the Ottoman Empire was completely annihilated, with over 40,000 soldiers killed and over 30,000 captured. The Ottomans themselves suffered fewer than 3,000 casualties, making it a resounding victory. As for why the Ottoman Macedonian army only had over 40,000 soldiers, the missing 10,000 or so were obviously being paid without paying. The reason for capturing so many was also largely due to the low morale of the Macedonian army, as most of its members came from various parts of the Balkans. Looking at the military report, the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legion was not only severely depleted of manpower, but also clearly lacking in equipment. Only half of its men were equipped with rifles, while the rest could only fight with melee weapons. Their fighting spirit was also weak, and many surrendered easily to the Greek army. It can be said that the internal corruption of the Ottoman Empire led to the Macedonian legion being weaker than Otto had anticipated, which was the fundamental reason for its annihilation in the first battle. In this way, Greece had achieved the first strategic objective of its war against the Ottomans. The entire process was easier than expected. According to the next plan, Greece needed to speed things up. Mahmud I in Istanbul received the battle report less than a day later than Otto, a result that enraged him. Before this battle, the commander of the Macedonian legion had confidently assured him that he would teach the Greeks a ruthless lesson. Although the Ottoman Empire had suffered repeated defeats in foreign wars over the years, its continued existence was largely due to the need for the great powers to maintain the balance of power in Europe. Before this, the Ottomans' opponents were all recognized great powers, especially the Russian Empire, their biggest rival, which was often referred to as the gendarmerie of Europe. Whether viewed by other powers or even by the Ottoman Empire itself, its strength remained considerable, and Greece, a small country, was hardly taken seriously by the Ottomans. The Ottomans actually held a significant psychological advantage over the Greeks. Greece had only gained independence from Ottoman rule in a little over a decade. Their initial independence was only achieved because of the interference or even direct intervention of other powers, which led to the Ottoman suppression of the Greek independence uprising. Otherwise, Greece would never have become independent. Even now, millions of Greeks still ruled within the Ottoman Empire, and they never considered the army composed of the seemingly submissive Greeks to possess much fighting power. This psychological advantage was also the root of Mahmud I's refusal to ally with Greece and his ruthless treatment of them. But now, his army, which he had meticulously trained for years, had been defeated by the Greeks. How could Mahmud I accept this? Unwilling to acknowledge the outcome, Mahmud I immediately wanted to mobilize more troops into the Balkans to completely crush the Greeks. But before the troop movement was complete, new news he received left Mahmud I utterly despondent. Just as the Greeks annihilated the Macedonian legions, a 50,000-strong Ottoman vanguard had already entered Syria. The Ottoman army initially encountered no resistance, which did not seem unusual to Ottoman commander Haftar Pasha, as intelligence indicated that Syria's defenses were currently weak. The Ottoman Empire's strategy was to seize this opportunity to invade Syria and capture Damascus. However, the Ottomans were unaware that their entry into Syria meant they had fallen into an Egyptian trap. The Ottoman army marched all the way to Aleppo, where they found their morale had waned due to the long march. Haftar Pasha decided to rest and replenish supplies in a small town called Najp. However, Egyptian troops had already laid an ambush there, and the main force of the Egyptian-Syrian army, led by Ibrahim, arrived as planned. Caught in a pincer attack, the Ottoman army suffered heavy losses, and Commander Haftar Pasha was taken prisoner by the Egyptians. Ibrahim, the Egyptian governor in Syria, did not hesitate to behead Haftar Pasha and cut off the beards of all the prisoners of war, sending them all to Mahmud II. The series of defeats led Mahmud II to question the meaning of life. Under immense pressure, he went mad after receiving war reports, constantly cursing Otto and Muhammad Ali. He toiled day and night, striving to reform and hopefully make the Ottoman Empire the most powerful country in the world again, but setbacks continued to plague him. The relentless attacks finally broke his composure. He tore the newsletter to shreds, kicked Haftar Pasha's head away, and then Mahmud II roared, "I still have 180,000 troops in Istanbul in Asia Minor, I still have a fleet, and the British will help us. Tell Palmerston that if the British fleet cannot march with us to destroy the Egyptian navy, I will cut off his head. After I defeat the Egyptians, I will assemble my army, storm Athens, capture Otto, take him to the palace of the great Saladridius, and hang him on the spire." Otto was unaware of the profound shock Mahmud II felt upon receiving news of the defeat. At this moment, he was more concerned with the success of the Greek navy and the detachment's operations. Meanwhile, in Alexandroupolis, east of Macedonia in the Balkans, news of the Macedonian legion's complete annihilation south of Kozani plunged the city into chaos. Alexandroupolis now had only a local garrison of less than 500 men, and the arrival of Sultanate reinforcements was uncertain. Wealthy people hurriedly packed their belongings, intending to flee, but the increasingly arrogant rebel forces outside the city prevented them from easily leaving its protection. Beginning in March, the Balkans seemed to spring up overnight with numerous rebels, fighting against Ottoman rule. They seized many villages and even towns, hanging local nobles and wealthy merchants and looting their possessions. The Ottoman Empire had always considered Egypt its greatest adversary. Before the war, Mahmud II, though confident, dared not underestimate the Egyptians. Therefore, after suffering successive defeats, the Ottoman Empire concentrated most of its main forces in Istanbul in Asia Minor. This arrangement allowed the Ottoman Empire to quickly mobilize troops to block Ishak's advance after its defeat on the Syrian front, but it inevitably left the Balkans vulnerable. Following the annihilation of the Macedonian legions, the entire Balkans became extremely weak, and local officials on the Balkan Peninsula were simply unable to suppress the insurgents. Just 5 days earlier, these insurgents had ambushed an Ottoman supply convoy less than 5 kilometers outside Alexandroupolis. It's worth noting that Alexandroupolis is located in western Thrace, and it would only take the Istanbul army a week to march there. The rebels, numbering 5,000, surrounded the transport convoy. Osman's escort of only 800 men was annihilated in less than 2 hours, and the supplies they were transporting were brazenly taken away by the rebels. Local officials who received the plea for help didn't even dare send troops from the city to support them. They simply closed the city gates and cowered in their residences. They didn't know when the rebels would become interested in Alexandroupolis, but almost everyone knew that if the rebels besieged the city, its 500-strong garrison would likely not hold out for long. The Ottoman Empire also wanted to suppress the uprisings across the country, but the Balkans seemed to have descended into chaos overnight, with insurgents appearing everywhere. Even in eastern Thrace, near Istanbul, insurgents had occupied local villages, prompting Istanbul to send troops to suppress them. However, upon seeing the regular army, the insurgents vanished without a trace. The troops sent to suppress them encountered a trap on the way, resulting in 4 soldiers being wounded. These insurgents in eastern Thrace were extremely cunning, never engaging the troops sent by Istanbul in direct combat. Upon spotting a large force, they would scatter and flee, avoiding direct combat and instead resorting to sniping from the mountains and forests or ambushing the army's logistics units. The suppressing forces, unable to find their main target, were themselves constantly harassed, suffering minimal losses but experiencing low morale. Even the uprisings in eastern Thrace, which the Ottoman Empire had sent 5,000 men to suppress, proved unsuccessful. The uprisings near Alexandroupolis were even less likely to be addressed. It was at this time that the Greek fleet arrived in the waters near the city of Alexandroupolis. Chapter 112 Whale Swallows. Liza stood on the ship's railing, binoculars in hand, observing the distant port of Alexandroupolis. Under the cover of night, the port's scattered lights flickered, creating an atmosphere of serene tranquility. Two second-class warships, escorting a transport ship carrying 3,000 Marines, approached the port. "Leader, get on the landing craft quickly. Be aware of any potential patrol personnel," Squad Leader Woga shouted, waving and urging his men to board. Once the ships were full, the landing craft on the side of the ship were launched into the sea, and all the Marines quickly rowed towards the port. No patrol personnel detected in the port area. The observer on the landing craft made a reassuring gesture, and everyone pushed harder. More than 50 landing craft approached the shore. "Hurry up, everyone ashore. Everyone's here. Follow me." After disembarking, wading through knee-deep water, and stepping onto the shore, Woga counted the number of people, determined the direction, and immediately led his men into the port. At this time, Osman had only deployed some port management personnel and a small number of patrol officers in the port. Woga's squad was responsible for the port warehouse management and security team. "These Ottomans are really lax. We've been at war for half a month, and they're still acting like nothing's wrong." After taking out 2 patrolmen and eliminating the gate guards, Woga's team wiped out the still sleeping security forces. The whole process was surprisingly easy. These Ottomans seemed completely unprepared for a Greek landing by sea. Aside from their usual patrols, they hadn't tightened their guard at all, allowing Woga's group to succeed with ease. It was really easy. We didn't encounter many patrols along the way. It felt much easier than our usual training. "If we had known, we wouldn't have needed to be so careful this time," said one of Woga's team members. In fact, Alexandroupolis had also issued orders to strengthen its defenses, but it couldn't maintain them for long. The security force was limited in size. If so many patrolled at night, what would happen during the day? The soldiers wouldn't get enough rest, and if they encountered the enemy, their fighting ability would be severely compromised. "Alright, assessing the enemy's strength is the key to consistent victory," Woga instructed. "Take a few men and keep watch around the area to prevent any accidents. I'll send a signal." A signal from the port. The lookout who had been monitoring the port saw the signal and quickly relayed the information. "Alright, bring the rest of the fleet closer, and notify the Royal Guard to prepare for landing." The fleet, which had been quietly anchored near the harbor, roared back to life with its steam engines, propelling it towards the port. While the fleet moved, the Marines didn't stop. 200 men remained to guard the prisoners and facilitate the Royal Guard's landing, while the rest quickly advanced towards the city of Alexandroupolis. That night, sporadic gunfire rang out in Alexandroupolis, waking many residents. However, none dared to investigate, only speculating whether guerrillas had stormed the city or a rebellion had broken out. The next day, as the sun rose, the residents of Alexandria, who had spent the entire night in unease, suddenly discovered that soldiers were patrolling the streets. They didn't recognize the Greek uniforms, but as the soldiers continued to shout, they quickly learned their identities and realized that Alexandria had been occupied by Greece. This seemed unbelievable. The Greeks had just defeated the Ottoman Macedonian legions hundreds of kilometers away. How could they suddenly appear in Alexandria, and in such large numbers? This was already in western Thrace. Had the Greeks flown here? In fact, the Ottomans never expected the Greeks to choose to land directly across the sea. Furthermore, their navy was currently assembling to prepare for battle against the Egyptians, and they had few spare warships patrolling the area. The Greek fleet, with its transport ships, arrived undetected by the Ottomans, and the entire landing operation proceeded extremely smoothly. Accompanying the fleet on the landing mission were 3,000 Marines and 2 divisions of the Guards. To ensure sufficient military strength on the homeland, the Janissaries, in addition to their 3 divisions, were expanded with 4 independent regiments, guaranteeing that the Janissaries on the European mainland would have a complete 3-division structure for this operation. Otto committed 2 full divisions to this campaign. After capturing Alexandroupolis, according to the operational mission, the Janissaries, after a day of rest, would continue eastward to establish a defensive line along the Evros River. This line essentially aligned with the future border between Turkey and Greece, and the Janissaries would then defend against potential Ottoman counterattacks. At this time, there were still 80,000 Ottoman troops in Istanbul. The guards were supported by about 5,000 guerrillas from the surrounding area, and 3,000 Marines were also under the command of the guards. However, these troops were busy stabilizing Alexandroupolis and the surrounding area, and it was impossible for them all to go to the front to support the guards. Therefore, the guards' next task was extremely difficult. Meanwhile, in Kazan, after defeating the Ottoman Empire's Macedonians, the commander of the Kazan army arranged for more than 30,000 prisoners to be sent to the rear for safekeeping. He then divided his troops into 3 routes, each heading north. After the annihilation of the Macedonian legion, Ottoman's forces in the Balkans consisted only of 120,000 border troops from the Principality of Moldavia and along the Dobroga line. However, facing the threat of Russian troops stationed nearby, they could only remain in their city fortresses, daring not to mobilize any more troops. In the eyes of Ottoman's commanders, his border troops were already struggling against the Russian forces. If they were to be divided further, the Russian border troops would certainly seize the opportunity to annihilate them. Therefore, even with a constant stream of battle reports, he dared not divide his forces. As for the local security forces, they were few in number and couldn't even handle the local rebel armies. In other words, the Balkan Peninsula was completely at the mercy of the Greek army. The Greek army split into 3 columns, advancing towards Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Bucharest respectively. To buy time, the 6 divisions in the 3 columns advanced quickly, carrying only their personal weapons and dry rations. The artillery and logistics battalions followed behind with artillery and supplies, marching normally. According to the plan, the troops on the forced march obtained their food and ammunition supplies directly from the large farms they passed along the way. These farms had already stockpiled sufficient dry rations, and could also provide some ammunition replenishment. After capturing the cities they passed through, they were handed over to the local partisans, placed under military rule, and Greek control was established. At this time, the number of partisans mobilized in various parts of the Balkans exceeded 90,000, which was the source of the Greek army's confidence to advance rapidly without worrying about problems in their rear. These partisans outnumbered the Ottoman local security forces by more than twice. Their combat effectiveness might not have matched that of the regular army, but it was still significantly stronger than the Ottoman local security forces, enough to ensure the relative stability of the rear. Clearly, Greece intended to seize the opportunity before other powers could react and completely annex the Balkans. Along the way, the main forces of the 3-pronged northern expedition captured cities and strongholds, with many surrendering or even changing hands before the main force even arrived. Over the years, Otto had also cultivated some local pro-Greek forces in the Balkans. These people usually didn't dare to do anything openly, at most secretly promoting the idea that the people of the Balkans were blood-related to the Greeks and that everyone should work together to build a greater Greece. But with the Greek army approaching, why wouldn't they hurry up and choose sides to try and get a bigger share of the spoils later? While the front lines are advancing rapidly, in Greece, the newly conscripted reserves have formed 3 reserve divisions and are undergoing training within the country to ensure that there are sufficient reserve forces to mobilize in the event of an unexpected situation or an attack on the homeland. Chapter 113 The Syrian War. This was essentially the final form of Otto's initial strategy, to seize the Balkans as quickly as possible, create a fait accompli before other countries could react, and then gain recognition through diplomacy. In short, the Ottoman Empire's Macedonian legions were wiped out, and 2 guards divisions that landed across the sea to the east occupied Alexandroupolis, stationing troops on the Evros River. The Ottoman forces in Istanbul could do nothing until they defeated the guards on the Evros. The troops stationed in Moldova and Dobroga, along with Russian forces, were bogged down and unable to move. The Ottoman Empire could only attempt to retake the Balkans by first defeating Egypt. After learning of the Ottoman vanguard's failed ambush in Syria by Ibrahim, Otto knew that defeating Egypt was impossible for the Ottomans, at least in the short term, and they might even suffer another major defeat. The main obstacle to Greece's success was not the Ottoman Empire, nor was it the reason he had risked a forced march on all 3 northern fronts. Greece's eagerness for speed stems from its inability to afford delays. If Russia or Austria react and mobilize their troops, truly determined to seize the territory, Greece would be no match. Even if they could temporarily hold out with their pre-established positions, Greece's strength simply couldn't sustain a prolonged confrontation with both armies, as the other continuously reinforced their forces. Even if they could hold out for a few months, they would ultimately succumb to logistical constraints and other issues. Therefore, The subsequent diplomatic maneuvering is crucial. In particular, if Greece could persuade Britain to support its occupation of the Balkans, it would have a better chance of either forcing the Ottoman Empire to sign a treaty quickly or preventing Austria and Russia from launching a war against the Greek army. In short, it wasn't too difficult for Greece to occupy the Balkans, but how much it could take depended on whether the British were willing to help. Fortunately, from the beginning of the war, Greece hadn't defended Britain. Even the declaration of war was a pretext offered by Mahmud II. Mahmud II initially rejected the proposal of a British-Greek alliance and later even insulted Greece, making Greece, which had long harbored ambitions, appear somewhat innocent on the surface and avoid a complete break with Britain. Therefore, although the British were very dissatisfied with Greece's actions, Otto believed that with British political acumen, as long as Greece served British strategy, the two sides could still sit down and discuss things properly. He knew that Britain's strategy in the Near East was to prevent Russian expansion in the Balkans. Under this premise, whether the Balkans were occupied by the Ottomans or the Greeks was not a question for the British. Furthermore, Greece's recent victory over the Ottoman Empire, annihilating the Macedonian legions, could convince the British that the Greek army was more powerful than the Ottomans. If Greece controlled the Balkans, Russian expansion there would face greater obstacles, which was actually beneficial to the British. In other words, Greece was a more useful and valuable ally than the Ottomans, making it worthwhile for Britain to cultivate a relationship with. In fact, at this time, British Foreign Secretary Palmerston was furious about Mahmud II's unreasonable behavior. He certainly didn't believe Mahmud II's claim that if the British fleet didn't join the Ottomans in attacking Egypt, Mahmud II would actually kill him. However, Mahmud II's attitude still greatly angered Palmerston. In his view, without British support, the Ottoman Empire would have long been partitioned by the great powers. As Foreign Secretary, representing Britain, how dare Mahmud II make such remarks, especially after two crushing defeats against Greece and Egypt? Greece, in particular, had the potential to become an ally of the Ottoman Empire and jointly attack Egypt, but Mahmud II's arrogance led Greece to ultimately choose to oppose the Ottomans. Mahmud II is now paying the price for his arrogance and underestimation of the enemy, and he has to find a way to clean up this mess. Palmerston's first thought was to mobilize a fleet to blockade the eastern Mediterranean, forcing Greece to cease hostilities and giving the Ottoman Empire some breathing room. However, he also worried that Otto, in his anger, might simply side with the Russians, at which point the Greek and Russian armies could easily crush the Ottomans' pitiful 120,000 troops on the Moldavian and Dobrogea fronts. Then the Russians could advance south along Moldavian, Wallachia, and Bulgaria, all the way to Constantinople. If such a thing were to happen, expecting the current Ottoman Empire to hold off the Russians would be utterly wishful thinking. More importantly, France is currently at odds with Britain, making it difficult for the British to garner allies. Is Britain really going to send its own army to fight Russia head-on? Unless there is absolute certainty that it can bring in the armies of other major powers, Britain will not confront Russia alone. Doing so would only bring joy to countries like France and Austria. Thinking of this, Palmerston hoped that the Ottoman army could play a role in defeating the Egyptian forces in Syria, which would make Greece seriously consider the war with the Ottomans. In fact, Otto was also closely following this battle between Egypt and the Ottomans. As far as he knew, Egypt had historically won this war. It wasn't until Britain rallied several major powers, diplomatically isolating Egypt, and even personally intervened, sending troops to form an alliance with the Ottoman army, that Egypt was defeated, helping the Ottoman Empire reclaim Syria and the Najd region. However, Otto didn't know exactly how Egypt had won the battle, and he was worried about the butterfly effect his involvement might cause, especially after learning that the British fleet in the Mediterranean had joined forces with the Ottoman navy, making it clear that the Ottomans had a higher chance of winning. After all, the formidable strength of the British navy was well known. During the last Greek War of Independence, the British Navy, with just two third-rate warships, routed the Ottoman and Egyptian navies. With naval support, barring any fatal mistakes, the Ottoman army was unlikely to lose. Under intense scrutiny, Ahmed, the Ottoman commander on the front lines, received orders to advance along the coastline, coordinating with the Ottoman navy. The land and sea forces would advance simultaneously, closing in on Ishaq's Syrian core. This arrangement allowed the Ottoman forces to support each other in the event of an attack. However, what followed was astonishing. Egypt achieved a near-total victory. The reason being that the Ottoman navy had been bribed by Muhammad Ali. On May 18, 1839, Just as the Egyptian navy was about to engage the combined British and Ottoman navies, the Ottoman navy suddenly betrayed them, turning its cannons against its former ally, the British Navy. Completely unprepared for this turn of events, the British Navy was caught off guard, losing 2 of its main battleships immediately. Meanwhile, Britain hadn't anticipated that Egypt's fleet was far larger than their intelligence suggested. It not only possessed 8 second-class battleships as its main force, but also secretly constructed 9 first-class battleships. Although naval warfare isn't solely about the size and number of warships, but also the quality of the navy, the tactics of both sides, and the firepower of artillery, in these aspects, the British fleet still held the advantage. However, from the outset, the British naval force, caught in a pincer attack, lost 1/3 of its main force. Coupled with the difficulty of defending both ends, it was unable to form a battle formation and had to find a way to quickly withdraw. Ultimately, only 1 second-class battleship and 2 third-class battleships withdrew from the battlefield under the cover of other ships. Even so, Britain still managed to sink 4 second-class battleships and several auxiliary ships of the Egyptian and mutinous Ottoman navies, and severely damaged 3 first-class Egyptian battleships, demonstrating the British Navy's superior naval combat skills. Unfortunately, the British Navy's excellent performance could not avert the Ottoman Empire's fate of defeat in this naval battle. The Egyptian and mutinous Ottoman navies then joined forces, and under the relentless bombardment of hundreds of heavy naval guns, the Ottoman forces had no chance to engage the Egyptian-Syrian legions and could only flee in disarray. On June 1, 1839, Ottoman's army retreated swiftly to the nearby city of Najp. Facing the relentless pursuit of the Syrian legions, the Ottoman army was forced to make a final stand there. At this time, the Egyptian-Syrian legions numbered only 70,000, while the Ottoman army still had a full 100,000 troops and held advantageous terrain. Ottoman commander Ahmed believed he still had a chance to turn the tide. However, events ultimately did not unfold as he had predicted. From the outset, the Egyptian army, equipped with the most advanced French weaponry, gained the upper hand. Although the Egyptian army numbered only 70,000, their weaponry was superior, their training more rigorous, and they were closer to a modern military force. Furthermore, having repeatedly defeated the Ottoman army in previous battles, their morale and discipline far surpassed that of the Ottomans. The Ottoman army's modern training was incomplete. The fleeing enemy, already demoralized, crumbled rapidly under Egyptian artillery fire. Ibrahim, seizing this opportunity, led his troops in a charge against the Ottoman artillery. In contrast, Ahmed's military police, even after beheading countless men, could not stop the army's rout. Seeing that the tide had turned against them, Ahmed knew that returning to Istanbul would not end well. Only dying in battle could spare his family's punishment. Therefore, he fired the last bullet from his gun, drew his curved sword, and, with a few remaining guards, charged the Egyptian army, ultimately dying on the battlefield. The Syrian War, which had garnered immense attention, ended in a crushing defeat for the Ottoman army. Chapter 114: Unleashing Forces Behind Enemy Lines. In this Syrian war, the Ottoman army suffered over 4,000 dead, countless wounded, and 30,000 captured. Ahmed was killed in action. Good. When the battle report reached Egypt, Muhammad Ali couldn't help but shout. The war had been so successful that he could hardly believe it. Seeing how easily the Ottomans' newly trained army had crumbled, Muhammad Ali decided to immediately march into the Anatolian peninsula, forcing the Ottoman Empire to cede Anatolia. Of course, before that, the most important thing was to demonstrate sufficient strength to minimize interference from other powers and ultimately partition Ottoman with Russia along the Tigris River. This victory over the British Navy should make those great powers carefully consider whether to intervene in the war. The French will also stand firmly on my side. As for the Greeks, Muhammad Ali thought of the intelligence he had received about the Greeks defeating the Macedonian legions and landing at Alexandroupolis. He finally laughed. Those Greeks picked a good time, letting them gain an advantage, but it also reduces our troubles. This way, we can more easily force the Ottomans to make concessions. At this time, the Ottoman Empire, due to the mutiny of its navy, had lost most of its newly trained army in Syria, leaving only 30,000 new soldiers and some miscellaneous troops in the capital, Istanbul. Faced with attacks from both the Greek and Egyptian armies, the Ottomans could only station their remaining main force in Istanbul while urgently recruiting militias to expand their army. Fortunately, Muhammad Ali had long favored oppressive rule, and many regions did not want to accept his brutal rule, so uprisings against Ottoman rule emerged in various places. Muhammad Ali originally intended to march onto the Anatolian peninsula, quickly seize Anatolia, threaten Istanbul, and force Mahmud I to sign a humiliating treaty. However, the emergence of these rebel groups delayed the Egyptian army's advance. Muhammad Ali found that these recurring rebel forces made his strategic intentions difficult to achieve in the short term. Enraged, he ordered his troops to plunder Anatolia, successfully creating a large number of displaced people in the region and greatly increasing local resistance. Under these circumstances, Muhammad Ali's plan to rapidly advance and force the Ottomans to sign a humiliating treaty failed, leaving him with no choice but to take the second path. However, he believed this was a test from God. In contrast, the Greek army's advance was extremely smooth. After the Battle of Kazan, General Corinth's main force of the Greek army split into 3 routes and marched north. Thanks to Greece's long-standing emphasis on marching training, with weekly long-distance marches through mountainous regions, coupled with the confidence gained from defeating the Ottomans, the soldiers did not complain much. These troops marched lightly, carrying only their personal weapons and provisions, and frequently encountered local guerrillas along the way. After contact, if the Greek army lacked food and ammunition, the guerrillas would lead them to nearby farms and provide them with supplies. Unlike the Egyptian army, they did not encounter any resistance along the way. Over the years, the large farms and missionaries scattered throughout the Balkans tirelessly proclaimed that everyone had Greek blood, the benevolence of King Otto, and the happiness of the Greek people. The return of many laborers who had gone to Greece to work as workers brought news of Greece's prosperity to the local population, filling many Balkan residents with longing for the country. The guerrilla groups organized by the large farms, known as the Greek Independence Army, primarily targeted local elites. Those who supported Ottoman were especially targeted and eliminated by the guerrillas, or forced to hide in the cities. These were mostly large landowners and merchants. After occupying their estates, the guerrillas would typically distribute the less easily transportable food supplies to the local population. The guerrillas' actions brought benefits to the local population. While they might be hesitant to approach the Greek army, few caused them any trouble. With the support of these guerrillas, the Greek army only needed to cooperate in capturing poorly defended cities and then handing them over to the local guerrillas for temporary military control. Later, new orders would be issued, and these guerrillas would be temporarily incorporated into the Greek army, since their commanders were originally Greek officers, essentially just a change of title. To outsiders, it seemed as if Greece had conjured a large army in its newly occupied territories, as if by magic. Did these so-called rebels try to negotiate, fight for rights, or cause trouble? Generally speaking, even if such rebels claimed to support Greece, they would definitely demand benefits, negotiate terms, and fight for local rights before they would submit. Greece even had to deploy troops to guard against these so-called rebels, preventing them from going back on their word and causing trouble, a common practice in Europe. Just like the forces currently hindering Egypt's continued advance, these are actually rebel armies formed by local powers in Asia Minor, aiming to oppose the Egyptian occupation and rule. However, if the Ottoman Empire wanted to command and incorporate these people, it had to offer them benefits and promises. At that time, European countries couldn't understand how to establish bases behind enemy lines, so no one expected Greece to be able to subdue the suddenly appearing rebel armies so quickly. In recent years, agricultural companies have established thousands of large farms in the Balkans, employing over 600,000 farm workers and their families. In addition, when they had free time, they arranged well-paid temporary jobs for the surrounding people. Orthodox missionaries preached in the area whenever they had free time, subtly influencing as many as 3 million people from the lower classes. These people may not have been farm laborers, but under their influence, they developed a favorable impression of Greece and did not show obvious resistance to the Greek army's occupation. During the guerrilla activities, many people in various areas provided assistance, and many even actively sought to join. Unlike most Europeans today who follow the upper middle class route, Otto essentially grasped the will of the people at the grassroots level. However, the ingrained habits of the local elites prevented them from seeing the ordinary people, whom they considered as insignificant as dust. Although the Balkan Peninsula covers more than 500,000 square kilometers, its population has barely exceeded 10 million due to years of frequent wars. This has resulted in vast tracts of land being abandoned, providing favorable conditions for the establishment of large-scale farms throughout the region. In this way, Greece has already been able to influence nearly one-third of the lower-class population. Europeans at the time had never seen anything like this before, and were completely unprepared for such a base-like operation behind enemy lines. This allowed Greece to suddenly gain control of the Balkan region's populace, even forming nearly 10 guerrilla units behind enemy lines when necessary. These guerrillas were commanded by Greek officers stationed on various farms and were centrally managed by Greece. This effectively created an additional army of nearly 100,000 men, a force comparable in size to the expansion of the Greek mainland. With such a massive force, Greece felt confident enough to launch a three-pronged northward offensive, intending to seize the Balkan Peninsula territory held by the Ottoman Empire. Otherwise, with its current army of over 100,000, Greece could only occupy a small portion of the nearby Piraeus region and the areas that Greece later reclaimed in a short period of time. If it wanted to continue its rapid expansion, its military efficiency would drop sharply. Chapter 115 Vienna Talks. Left parenthesis. General Corinth's army split into three columns, advancing triumphantly northwards. On the eastern front, having just captured the imperial guard at Alexandroupolis, they had reached the vicinity of the Evros River and begun garrisoning. The commander ordered the soldiers to set up barracks and establish defensive lines, while simultaneously dispatching scouts to investigate Ottomans' movements. However, the scouts found no indication of any Ottoman troop movements in this area, only Ottoman reconnaissance personnel. After several reconnaissance squads were wiped out, even these Ottoman scouts disappeared, as if they had never seen these troops appear in the vicinity of eastern Thrace, where the Ottoman capital was located. Closely monitor the Ottoman movements. Report any approaching Ottoman troops immediately, the Greek commander on the eastern front instructed after receiving the scouts' report. His two divisions were tasked with holding off the Ottomans. Intelligence indicated that, including the urgently conscripted troops, the Ottomans had approximately 80,000 men in Istanbul. However, they could only deploy a maximum of 50,000 to 60,000 troops a year, as Istanbul couldn't be left undefended. In terms of numbers, they weren't at a significant disadvantage, and the Ottoman Empire couldn't expect to train its hastily conscripted troops effectively in the short term. However, the Evros River is so long that it's impossible for a small force to cover every inch of it. It would be disastrous if the enemy were to cross the river undetected and launch a surprise attack. Therefore, scouting the movements of his old acquaintances was of paramount importance. His task here was to hold the Evros River line and ensure the safety of the newly conquered territories to the west. As for attacking Constantinople, that wasn't yet part of Greece's initial strategic plan. According to the estimates of the major powers at this time, Greece should have only just occupied Macedonia and Epirus and was still busy stabilizing its territory. In reality, two of the three armies that were launching the northern expedition had already entered Bulgaria and Serbia, capturing the important cities of Sofia and Vranje respectively. Another force had already reached Podgorica, not far from the later famous city of Sarajevo. Sofia was the capital of the Bulgarian region, but even before the Greek army could attack, its garrison surrendered decisively. There was no other way. Sofia had only a little over 1,000 defenders facing a Greek army of nearly 50,000, including surrounding guerrillas. If they didn't surrender, their fate wouldn't be much better. The Greeks readily accepted this, as such a swift surrender saved them the trouble of a full-scale attack, saving considerable time, crucial for Greece's current pursuit of a rapid advance. Seeing the Ottoman Empire's repeated setbacks in its wars against Egypt and Greece, everyone speculated about when the Ottomans would surrender. Although the Russians were preoccupied with the Polish Slava, everyone knew the Slava would ultimately fail. Fearing that the Russians, after defeating the Slava, would advance into the Balkans, Austria also became restless. Austrian Prime Minister Metternich convened a conference of the great powers in accordance with the Treaty of Mönchengladbach. This conference not only invited the four major powers, Britain, France, Russia, and Prussia, but also the three main protagonists of the war, Greece, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire. Envoys from various countries arrived in Vienna. At the meeting, Prime Minister Metternich spoke first. "Gentlemen, the Near East is currently engulfed in war, and the people are deprived of peace. As a peace-loving nation, Austria has invited you here to discuss the situation in the Near East and to restore peace as soon as possible." Before he could finish speaking, the Egyptian foreign minister immediately retorted, "We also yearn for peace, but this war was started by the Ottomans, and they must bear the consequences. The Ottomans must surrender Anatolia." "That's right, Mamudai insulted the Greeks. Greek dignity is inviolable. The territory now occupied by our Greek army was historically seized from Greece by the Ottomans and should be returned to us. Impossible. The Ottoman representative immediately rejected the proposal from Egypt and Greece, shouting, "Egypt and Greece have committed numerous atrocities on our territory. I demand that their armies immediately withdraw from Ottoman Empire territory and compensate us for our losses." The three countries began clashing for their own interests. Without prior communication, representatives from Egypt and Greece unanimously condemned the Ottoman Empire for initiating the war, repeatedly citing the historical harm inflicted on both nations by the Ottoman Empire. Greece, in particular, raised the banner of punishing heretics, a politically correct stance even though the Pope in Rome was largely forgotten. This was immediately endorsed by the Russian representative, who stated that the Russian Empire was also prepared to send troops to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territory. However, Britain, Prussia, and Austria were unwilling to see Russian troops present in the Balkans. British Representative Palmerston immediately spoke up, "Gentlemen, please calm down. I believe this war broke out due to a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? HMPH, did the Ottoman army and the British fleet enter Syria for a vacation? The Egyptian representative scoffed. "In that case, our Greek army is simply enjoying the nice weather," the Greek foreign minister added. The meeting started off poorly. Although Britain, Austria, and Prussia hoped for a three-way ceasefire, Greece and Egypt both made territorial claims against the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire's representatives were not about to concede so easily. With British support, they resolutely rejected the demands of Egypt and Greece. Russia and France, meanwhile, were secretly fanning the flames. However, the French only subtly expressed support for Egypt, while Russia was practically openly declaring its intention to invade the Balkans. In fact, Austria now had an option: to immediately send troops to Serbia, seize Belgrade, the key to the Balkans, and strategically gain complete initiative in the offensive against the Balkans. But Austria was already facing numerous internal problems. Last year's severe drought had severely damaged Austria, while Hungary was taking advantage of the situation to cause trouble. Having missed two crucial periods, the German customs union and the rapid development of railways, Greece was now extremely weak, with fiscal revenue of only 140 million florins, far less than other major powers. Lacking funds, military reforms and re-equipping of the army were dragging on, leaving Austria extremely vulnerable and without the resources to wage war. Furthermore, Austria was completely unaware of the Greek army's ability to advance rapidly and was utterly unprepared, resulting in its army still not being mobilized. Even though Metternich had just received a letter from Milos Obrenović, a representative of the Serbian separatists, pleading for help, he did not intend to immediately mobilize the Austrian army. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 116: Average Value of Elite Individuals. At this time, northern Serbia was already in a state of high independence, even having formed its own autonomous government. However, due to the weakness of the Ottoman Empire itself and the obstruction of the great powers, it could only manage the situation but could not resolve the issue. Milos Obrenović was the representative of the Serbian independence movement. Initially, because of this identity, he was courted by several great powers. However, due to his fickle strategy, he sided with Britain one day, Russia the next, and Austria the day after, and the great powers gradually grew disgusted and distrustful of him. Even in his letter to Metternich, he said that he had been deceived and believed the Russians, and that the Russians and those Serbian traitors were despicable and shameless. Furthermore, the Greek army was already approaching Belgrade, and the Greeks were cruel and violent. They hoped the Austrian army would rescue the Serbian people from their misery. Finally, in the closing remarks, it was written that even such cloying words from Milos Obrenović, the most loyal servant of the Habsburg family, failed to sway Prime Minister Metternich. Metternich didn't believe this liar, nor did he believe the Greek army had advanced so quickly. Only 2 months after the Battle of Kazan, they had already reached Belgrade. After such a major battle, the troops needed to rest for a few days, then disperse to occupy surrounding towns and transportation routes, negotiate with local forces, and stabilize the region. The Greek army was mostly still in western and central Macedonia at this time, making a direct forced march to Belgrade impossible. Did the Greeks not even need to guarantee their supply lines? Actually, some in the Austrian military had previously suggested taking advantage of the situation to conquer Serbia, but Hungary then became agitated. They worried that the Serbian invasion would weaken their rights within the Austrian Empire and also wanted to gain a more independent status and rights. Hungary's unrest, coupled with the economic crisis and natural disasters, had already destabilized Austria internally, so the proposal to send troops to Serbia was temporarily shelved. After all, according to Metternich, a country with an area of less than 100,000 square kilometers and a population of just over 1 million could at most occupy regions like Epirus, Macedonia, and western Thrace. This was a much larger territory than mainland Greece, and Greece wouldn't have the resources to occupy Serbia afterward. In any case, Prime Minister Metternich didn't believe the Serbians' words. He was more worried about Russia than Greece. Although the Polish uprising has slowed the Russian advance, the Polish secession army, despite its bravery, has had its operational area greatly reduced in the face of the Russian army. The Russian forces are already preparing to besiege Warsaw, and the Polish defeat is only a matter of time. Once the secession army is dealt with, the Russians will certainly be able to free up resources to intervene in the Balkans. This is what Prime Minister Metternich is worried about. The main purpose of this meeting is to hope that the Near East will be calmed down as soon as possible, so as not to give the Russians any opportunity to exploit the situation. In reality, British Representative Palmerston shared similar concerns with Metternich. He had initially believed that with the assistance of the British Navy, the war in Syria would surely yield a positive outcome. Britain would then be able to force Egypt to cease hostilities, and Palmerston would only need to visit Athens to persuade the Ottoman Empire to cede some interests, thus convincing Greece to agree to a ceasefire. This would allow Britain to unite with other nations to contain the Russians. However, the Ottoman Empire's naval defection completely ruined everything. The unprepared British fleet, though valiant, was forced to withdraw from the battlefield due to enemy attacks and the betrayal of its allies. He had repeatedly cursed Mahmud I's foolishness behind his back, for failing to even guarantee the loyalty of his own men. Despite receiving news of another crushing defeat in the Syrian campaign, Mahmud I was so shocked and enraged that his health collapsed. Even as his days drew near, he continued to curse Mahmud I, wishing him a future in hell. Now, Palmerston had to find a way to clean up the mess left by the Ottoman Empire. Egypt and Greece were at war with the Ottoman Empire. Egypt was clearly hostile to Britain and, with French support, would not easily agree to end the war. More importantly, Britain was unwilling to allow Egypt, aligned with France, to expand. After careful consideration, Palmerston chose Greece as his entry point because, in his view, although Greece was also ambitious about the Ottoman Empire, it was a pro-British regime. Therefore, shortly after the conference, Palmerston arranged a private meeting with the Greek foreign minister. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Palmerston stated his purpose: Britain hopes that Greece can immediately end the war with the Ottoman Empire. That's impossible, the foreign secretary replied without hesitation. Greece has paid countless sacrifices for the current victory. We cannot let the Ottomans off so easily. For centuries, the Ottomans have owed the Greeks countless blood debts. Now is the time for reckoning. Seeing this attitude, Palmerston knew that Greece would not accept without sufficient benefits, so he presented his prepared terms: if Greece can immediately cease hostilities, I can persuade the Ottoman Empire to cede Macedonia and Epirus to Greece as compensation. Even if the Ottomans disagree, these territories are currently in Greek hands, the foreign secretary said calmly. If the Ottomans believe they can reclaim these places from Greece, then so be it. Upon hearing this, Palmerston warned, making too many demands is not a good thing. The British Mediterranean fleet can blockade the entire eastern Mediterranean at any time, preventing a single ship from approaching Greek ports. The British Navy is indeed powerful, but their primary task now is dealing with the Egyptian Navy, the Foreign Secretary said. As far as I know, the British Mediterranean fleet suffered considerable losses in the naval battle in the Syrian waters. However, it was only a squadron that was damaged. The British Empire can mobilize several times its size to the Mediterranean at any time. That battle was a shameful betrayal. We were caught off guard, allowing the Egyptians to succeed. We will not give Egypt another chance. Furthermore, don't assume that getting close to the Russians will guarantee victory in the end. Remember, the main Russian forces are currently suppressing the rebellion in Poland. Perhaps by the time they arrive, the war will already be over. The war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire had nothing to do with the Russians. We were merely trying to settle centuries-old grievances. The foreign minister, sensing a probing tone, immediately denied any connection between Greece and Russia. In fact, Greece had not consulted with Russia before the war broke out. Otto understood that Russia wouldn't simply watch Greece annex the Balkans. If a joint military intervention had been agreed upon beforehand, given Russia's appetite, Greece's gains wouldn't have been as substantial as they are now. In fact, if Russia had secretly allied with Russia beforehand and known about the Greek army's achievements, Russia might already be demanding that Greece cede Wallachia and Bulgaria for Russian occupation. If Greece refused, it would be tantamount to betraying the alliance, further alienating Russia. Otto wanted to maintain relatively friendly relations with Russia in the future and didn't want complete confrontation. Naturally, he couldn't leave the impression of a traitor in Nicholas I's mind. In that case, you wouldn't want to directly annihilate the Ottoman Empire, would you? That's something Britain absolutely cannot accept. Palmerston wasn't entirely convinced by Greece's claim that they hadn't secretly allied with Russia, even though the intelligence he'd gathered indicated that Greece hadn't signed any alliance or similar agreement with Russia before the war. He felt that Greece's willingness to launch such a direct attack was likely due to Russian pressure. Diplomatic negotiations always involve considering the demands of both sides. Britain had already stated its price, and now it was up to Greece to decide. This is the latest intelligence I've received from the military. Your Excellency Palmerston, you may take a look. The foreign minister did not state his request directly, but simply handed a document to Palmerston. Upon receiving the document, Palmerston couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, "Is this true? You've really already captured Belgrade?" Belgrade isn't far from Vienna. The news will reach Vienna in a day or two at most. I wouldn't stoop to deceiving your Excellency with this information. In fact, not only Belgrade, but we've already occupied Bulgaria. Before long, Bosnia and the Principality of Wallachia will also fall into our hands. The foreign minister's seemingly calm words carried a hint of smugness. In another half-month at most, we will have occupied most of the Ottoman Empire's Balkan Peninsula, besieging the Ottoman northern legions in Moldavia and Dobroga. How is this possible? Did the Greek army merely stage an armed parade? Did no one in the Ottoman Empire resist? Palmerston couldn't help but show a look of surprise. He knew that Egypt's advance into Asia Minor had met with fierce resistance from the local population, leaving the Egyptian army somewhat bogged down. But what was going on with Greece? They had completed the occupation so quickly, as if their march had encountered no resistance whatsoever, as if it were just a leisurely outing. Were all the people of the Balkans pro-Greek? Chapter 117. He was outmaneuvered. That's the truth. The Ottoman Empire's rule in the Balkans has long been unpopular. Wherever our Greek army goes, they were all welcomed by the local people, and many places even spontaneously organized guerrilla groups to support the Greek army. The foreign minister showed a proud expression. He was not yet clear how Otto had managed to get the people of the Balkans to welcome the Greek army so much, and even to have them actively join in. He simply believed that Greece had been doing a good job of propaganda all along, and the people of the Balkans had long had enough of Ottoman rule, which was why they supported the Greek entry. Otto could not casually publicize the matter of establishing a base behind enemy lines, and he had not even discussed it with his cabinet members. Everything was arranged and carried out by the royal family. However, after this war, such things could no longer be concealed. Various countries would inevitably become aware of the situation, given the large number of people involved. The cabinet had already noticed some clues. The instructors on those large farms were all officers who would join the army in the future. Although they were all under a gag order, it was impossible to completely hide the truth. As time went on, some scattered news would inevitably leak out. Fortunately, Otto had initially used many different fronts on his large farms abroad. On the surface, they didn't all belong to agricultural companies, and the large farms within the territories of powerful nations like Britain, France, Russia, and Austria had always been quite well behaved. There was no reserve training or anything like that. It was just a normally operating farm, at most with strong discipline and a high degree of organization for its farm workers. Otto never intended to do these things within the spheres of influence of the great powers. From the beginning, Otto's targets for his underhanded tactics were regions like the Balkans, where local control was weak, especially in areas where the Ottoman Empire's central authority couldn't reach. The Ottoman Empire was Greece's primary enemy, and given that Greece naturally wielded considerable influence in the Balkans at that time, everything proceeded so smoothly. engaging in underhanded tactics within the territories of powerful nations, not only because those nations have greater control over the regions, but also because if caught red-handed, Greece would become a target of public criticism. Palmerston was taken aback. He had initially thought that Greater Greece was merely a Greek fantasy, although he knew that many missionaries in the Balkans were constantly promoting Hellenism within Ottoman territory. He truly hadn't expected such widespread support in the Balkans, or that the Greek army's entry would garner so much popular backing. Indeed, it was a fact. According to the military reports, the Greek army had already occupied most of the Balkan peninsula and enjoyed the support of the local population. This led Palmerston to believe that the Ottoman Empire was truly unpopular in the Balkans, and that Greek occupation of the Balkan peninsula was the will of the people. While he thought this way, Palmerston couldn't easily accept the status quo. No country will allow Greece to occupy the Balkan peninsula. Does Greece want to provoke the anger of other countries? If Greece doesn't occupy these territories, are they just waiting for the Russians to quell the Polish rebellion and then occupy them with a large army? The foreign minister said calmly. If this is what your country desires, then we can stop our advance into Wallachia and cede Wallachia, Moldavia, and Bulgaria to the Russians. For Greece, it would be good to occupy these regions, but not occupying them, while regrettable, would also avoid offending Russia. After all, Greece has already gained enough from this war, and it should know when to stop. What does Your Excellency think of this proposal? The Foreign Secretary smiled at Palmerston. No. Palmerston objected without hesitation. How could Britain possibly allow the Russians to have the opportunity to enter the Balkans? After his rebuttal, Palmerston realized he had been checkmated, or rather, ever since Greece declared war on the Ottomans and the Ottomans suffered a series of defeats, the situation had become drastically different from what he had anticipated. The Foreign Secretary, though not explicitly stating it, made it clear that Britain had to choose. If Britain supported Greece's occupation of the Balkans, Greece would side with the British and block Russian access to the region. Conversely, Greece would consolidate its other territories, securing them first, and then watch as the Russians entered the Balkans, and even further, conquer Constantinople, gaining access to the Mediterranean. This was something the British absolutely did not want to see. Many countries oppose Russian entry into the Balkans, but few are influential enough to stand against Russia and wage war. The meeting convened by Austrian Prime Minister Metternich aimed to curb Russian expansion in the Balkans. However, Palmerston had already recognized Austria's weakness. Otherwise, Metternich's stance towards Russia would have been much tougher, instead of pushing other countries to take the lead. Currently, the French are supporters of Egypt, and still enemies of the Ottomans and Britain. Britain does not want Egypt, a hostile nation, to continue its expansion. Palmerston even hoped to sever Egypt's reach into Asia, turning it into a supplier of British cotton. This would make it difficult for Britain to ally with France in this Near Eastern war. Therefore, if Greece were to truly side with Russia, or even without an alliance, simply halting its advance and allowing Russian troops into the Balkans, it would be something Britain would not want to see. The Ottoman Empire could not possibly resist a Russian invasion on its own and then reclaim the Greek-occupied territories. As for whether the Ottoman Empire's troops stationed in Moldavia and Dobroga could stop a large Russian army from advancing south? Judging from the performance of the Ottoman Empire's army during this period, Palmerston didn't believe it was possible. Unless Britain itself committed troops to fight Russia, but facing the Russians alone was something the British certainly didn't want. By this time, Palmerston understood the Greeks' intentions. They actually wanted to annex the Balkans and gain recognition from most of the major powers, led by Britain. In the past, Palmerston would have thought this was a fantasy. After all, Greece was a small country of less than 70,000 square kilometers, while the Balkans covered over 500,000 square kilometers. Now Greece actually wants to swallow up 6 or 7 times its own territory. If it weren't for the current situation, Palmerston would probably have immediately mocked the Greeks for their insatiable greed. But considering the current situation, Palmerston suddenly felt that, rationally speaking, supporting Greece at this time was the most suitable option for Britain. Perhaps this was also what Greece wanted. Palmerston then recalled Otto's various actions since becoming king, especially Greece's recent performance in the Near East War. He couldn't help but admire this Bavarian prince as a truly remarkable figure, perfectly utilizing the situation in the Near East War. His Majesty Otto is willing to ally with Britain against Russia? Palmerston quickly demonstrated the flexible stance of a foreign secretary, starting by arguing for Britain's best interests in the current situation. That, of course, depends on whether your country is willing to support Russia's choice. If your country is willing to support Greece in reclaiming its ancient territories, then the Greek people will fight against any enemy that attempts to invade Greece in order to defend this hard-won victory. The foreign secretary smiled and said, "Of course, Greece has already spent a great deal of money on this war, and its domestic economy has been affected. Our country also hopes to receive your country's financial assistance." Palmerston wasn't surprised by the foreign secretary's request. After all, given Greece's economic situation, the fact that they could maintain an army of over 100,000 was already surprising. Palmerston guessed that Otto had probably emptied his own coffers for this war. "Are you confident you can defeat the Russians?" This was actually Palmerston's biggest concern. Britain wasn't short of funds. In the past, to deal with Napoleon, Britain, as the financial backer of the anti-French coalition, had provided financial aid to many European countries. Now, to deal with the Russians, Britain wouldn't mind aiding Greece, provided it was worthwhile. "At least we are more confident than the Ottomans in defending our territory in the Balkans," the foreign minister said confidently. "Don't forget, our army recently annihilated the Ottoman Macedonian legion with overwhelming superiority." Chapter 118 discusses conditions. Even though Palmerston was somewhat displeased by the implicit smugness in the foreign secretary's words, he had to admit that war was the best stage to test an army's strength. Since the Greek army had defeated the Ottoman Macedonian legions, it naturally had more confidence than the Ottomans in confronting the Russian army. In this era, strength was the best weapon to protect one's interests, especially military strength, and the Greeks proved their strength with actual battle results. While Greece's national strength may be far inferior to Russia's, its army was more powerful than the Ottoman army. Given sufficient funding, Greece was clearly more capable of holding the Balkans. Considering this, Palmerston felt that allowing Greece to occupy Ottoman territory in the Balkans wasn't necessarily a bad thing. After Greece occupied the Balkans, if Russia wanted to expand westward, the two sides would inevitably become enemies. Faced with a powerful Russia, Greece's only remaining support would be Britain, just like the Ottoman Empire, ultimately becoming a pawn for Britain in maintaining the strategic balance in the Near East. Moreover, compared to the Ottoman Empire's dismal performance in this war, Greece is clearly a more valuable pawn. Given more time to develop, with its Balkan territory, Greece might even become a crucial British asset in continental Europe, much like Prussia is today. Prussia could be used to prevent Austria from unifying Greater Germany and maintain the balance of power in Central Europe, while Greece could be used to maintain the balance of power in the Near East. Currently, France supports Egypt against the British, and Austria and Prussia's diplomatic opposition alone is unlikely to deter Russian ambitions. However, with the addition of Greece and British support, Russia could certainly be effectively contained within the Black Sea. Thinking this, Palmerston said, "I am merely the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. If Greece needs a loan, it will need to speak with the bankers. However, I know several reliable gentlemen who should be willing to provide the best financial services. On behalf of Greece, I thank your country for its efforts in maintaining peace in the Near East. Greece will always be one of Britain's closest friends." Although Palmerston did not directly state his position, the Foreign Secretary understood that Britain would tacitly acknowledge Greece's occupation of the Balkans and would be willing to help Greece mediate with the Ottomans to persuade the Ottoman Empire to cede the Balkans. Palmerston didn't really care what the Ottoman Empire thought. Selling out an ally was a traditional British tactic, something they were always willing to do without hesitation when needed. Britain supported the Ottomans to prevent Russian access to the Mediterranean, and now that better options were available, the Ottomans were no longer as useful to Britain. Instead, the Ottoman Empire needed Britain's help, and Palmerston believed the Ottomans would understand the situation. Having achieved his goal, the Foreign Secretary naturally took the opportunity to clarify Greece's position and planned to finalize the loan agreement as soon as possible. The British loan was exactly what Greece desperately needed. Since the start of the war, Greece's war funds had been spent like water, even faster than initially anticipated. Although Otto still had money privately, and most of the treasures from the Hindu temples were still in the royal bank's vaults, with gold from California continuously flowing into Athens, Greece still had many other expenses. Aside from Nicholas I's potential military intervention in the Balkans, the economic development of such a large newly acquired territory would also consume vast sums of money. If Otto could secure a loan from Britain, he could invest more in the Balkans, thus stabilizing the region more quickly. Besides the Balkans, There was also the development of colonies in Central and Southern Africa. Investing in these areas would bring even greater benefits. Taking advantage of Britain's current need for Greece, there was room for negotiation on loan interest rates and terms, avoiding excessive costs. After reaching an agreement, Palmerston quickly presented his first condition: Greece must end its war with the Ottoman Empire as soon as possible, and the Near East must be stabilized quickly. On this point, Greece and Britain share the same demand. However, getting the Ottoman Empire to acknowledge the status quo requires Your Excellency's involvement, the Foreign Secretary stated. I think the Ottoman Empire also hopes to end the war with Greece as soon as possible, since it benefits neither side and only allows other countries to profit, Palmerston said. However, for the Near East to be completely stable, Egypt needs to stop its aggression against the Ottoman Empire, and I hope Greece can do its part for this. Clearly, this was Britain's second condition, and Palmerston wanted to see whether Greece was just paying lip service or truly willing to follow Britain's lead. In response, the foreign minister offered his prearranged reply: Egypt is an insatiable nation. During the Greek War of Independence, Muhammad Ali attempted to prevent Greek independence for his own ambitions, incurring countless blood debts from the Greek people. After his defeat, due to disputes over the division of spoils, he turned against the Ottoman Empire and shamelessly seized Crete, which rightfully belonged to Greece. Greece will certainly not allow such a nation's ambitions to continue to expand. Greece has always felt that continuing to allow Egypt to occupy Crete and Syria was a mistake. However, Greece is currently at war with the Ottoman Empire, and the main force of our army will need to remain on the front lines to defend against a possible Russian attack. Dealing with Egypt is likely beyond our capabilities. As expected, the Greeks have always been obsessed with Crete. Palmerston quickly understood the underlying meaning of the foreign minister's words. Getting Greece to deal with Egypt was not a problem, but sufficient benefits had to be offered, such as the Crete and Syria currently occupied by Egypt. Many Greeks now live on Crete. During the Greek Wars of Independence, the people of Crete responded, but were suppressed. Now Crete is under Egyptian control, and the foreign minister sees it as understandable that Greece wanted a share of the spoils of war. Palmerston also knew that the Greeks had always considered Crete as territory they were determined to reclaim, so this condition wasn't entirely unexpected. However, judging from the foreign minister's tone, it seems he also has some ambitions regarding Syria. If Greece joins the peacekeeping force and makes sufficient contributions, it will naturally receive the benefits it deserves. Palmerston did not directly agree. Having acquired the Balkans, Greece had the potential to transform from a small country into a great power. Although this was beneficial to British strategy, Britain could not continue to unconditionally satisfy Greece. For Palmerston, allowing Greece's appetite to grow further was not a good thing. If Greece was willing to contribute, reclaiming Crete would not be a problem. The key issue was Syria, which required careful consideration. Rest assured, the Greek Navy is currently patrolling the eastern Mediterranean and has encountered the Egyptian Navy several times. If your country engages in battle with the Egyptian Navy, the Greek Navy can also provide assistance. Furthermore, if the Russians can be persuaded to accept the status quo, a portion of the Greek army can be deployed to participate in the war against Egypt. The foreign minister's meaning was clear. The Greek army's primary task was currently to defend against the Russians, but the navy was largely unused. In fact, the Greek army could even contribute if it could prevent Russia from intervening in the Balkans. Palmerston was quite satisfied with Greece's statement, knowing that the Greeks had been expanding their navy for years. Even in pursuit of colonial expansion, the Greek navy grew to a size that the British Mediterranean fleet could not ignore, despite being the smallest among the major fleets. Because the Greek navy employed many British constructors, many aspects of its operations were known to the British. While the Greek navy's combat strength might not have matched that of the British, according to these instructors, although it had not yet experienced a major war, its training was consistently thorough, its sailors were of good quality, and its combat effectiveness had improved rapidly in recent years. While the Greek navy may not be as powerful as the British and French navies today, it is comparable to the Russian navy, provided it performs well in combat. Although Palmerston doesn't hold the Russian navy in high regard, this assessment demonstrates that the Greek navy's combat capabilities are among the best in the world. Based on this evaluation, Palmerston believes the Greek navy can be effective in the fight against the Egyptian navy, thus making Britain's efforts against Egypt less strenuous. Even if Greece were willing to deploy its army, Britain might not need to mobilize many troops from its homeland to deal with Egypt. Palmerston had always harbored resentment over the previous failures of the British Royal Navy, and he certainly hadn't expected that after being taught a lesson by the Royal Navy years ago, Muhammad Ali had been quietly enhancing the strength of the Egyptian Navy, secretly building many first-class warships, and even bribing the Ottoman Empire's navy. In terms of naval size, the Egyptian Navy now far surpasses the British fleet deployed in the Mediterranean. Although naval power isn't solely determined by the number of ships, the British Mediterranean fleet was absolutely confident of defeating the Egyptian fleet. However, with the assistance of the Greek Navy, the outcome would be even easier. More importantly, the war against Egypt would thoroughly draw Greece into Britain's camp, making Greece a pawn in the Near East. Chapter 119 Metternich's Demand. Impossible. The Ottoman Empire could never accept such humiliating terms. At the residence of the Ottoman representative, the Greek foreign minister presented Greece's armistice terms. First, the cession of Macedonia, Serbia, Bulgaria, the principalities of Moldova and Wallachia, Epirus and Poch, and Thrace except for eastern Thrace. Second, a reparation payment of 100 million drachmas to Greece, plus 10 million drachmas to redeem the Macedonian legion's soldiers. The third condition, a formal apology to Greece for previous contemptuous remarks. Leaving aside the subsequent series of conditions, such as allowing Greek Orthodox priests to freely preach in Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire could not accept even the first condition. The cession of over 400,000 square kilometers of land in one fell swoop. Few countries would easily agree to such a condition. If the Ottoman representative accepted this condition, his political career would be over. However, the defeat on the battlefield had diminished the Ottoman representative's confidence when facing Greece. He could only rely on the British Foreign Secretary, Palmerston, beside him. But Palmerston's next words plunged him into despair. I think the Ottoman Empire should carefully consider the Greeks' conditions and restore peace to the Near East as soon as possible. This way, they can concentrate their efforts on dealing with Egypt and guarding against potential threats, Palmerston continued. The Ottoman representative didn't listen carefully to what he was about to say, because that first sentence already implied that the British wanted the Ottomans to agree to the Greeks' conditions. This made the Ottoman representative dizzy. The Ottoman Empire was suffering repeated defeats on the front lines. Mahmud II's newly formed army, which he had high hopes for, was performing like a clown, bringing nothing but failure against both the Egyptians and the Greeks. Besides, wasn't it the British who initially worried about the Ottoman Empire's war against Egypt? Thinking of this, Osman's representative couldn't help but feel a surge of anger, his eyes filled with fury as he looked at Palmerston. After a while, Osman's representative managed to suppress his outburst and gradually regain his composure, saying, "This matter is not something I can decide. I will report it to the domestic authorities, and His Excellency the Sultan will make the decision. If you two have nothing else to say." In the end, Osman's representative couldn't help but reveal some of his anger and chose to directly see his guests out. Hopefully the Ottomans will make a decision soon. If things drag on, Russia will likely be able to make its move soon. Moreover, the Ottoman Empire needs to quickly liberate its troops along the Moldavian and Dobroga lines in order to resist the Egyptian attack. Palmerston didn't care about the Ottoman representative's attitude, it was just the rage of an incompetent man, something he had witnessed more than once. He was merely offering a final reminder to prevent the Ottoman Empire from making a wrong choice in an irrational state. As for the Greek foreign minister, he felt a sense of satisfaction. Being able to watch the Ottomans eat was a way of getting revenge for the humiliation he'd suffered at the hands of Mahmud II in the Grand Salario Palace. Don't assume diplomats are thick-skinned and forgiving, he'd been waiting for this moment. If he hadn't heard Mahmud II was seriously ill, he would have loved to retaliate in front of them. But now, he decided against it. If things went too far and he angered the Ottomans to death, it would become a major diplomatic incident. After leaving the Ottoman representative's residence, the two went to see Austrian Prime Minister Metternich. To ensure the successful annexation of the Balkans by Greece, they needed to secure the consent of more major powers. Palmerston had met with Metternich before, and because of that meeting, he harbored no goodwill towards Metternich. However, Palmerston believed that Austria would certainly consider its own interests and hinder the expansion of Russia and France. If they could prevent the Russians from extending their reach into the Balkans, defeat Egypt, and squeeze out the French, the British could use Greece and the Ottoman Empire to continue controlling the situation in the Near East. At the same time, they could achieve their initial goal of making Egypt, and even the entire Near East, a dumping ground for British goods and a source of raw materials. At this time, many within Austria believed that if they could conquer Serbia, especially control Belgrade, Austria would no longer need to worry about attacks from the Balkans and would have no more concerns about its rear. However, Metternich believed that if Austria actually occupied Serbia, it would certainly be seen as a thorn in Russia's side. Nicholas I had always proclaimed himself the protector of Orthodox Christianity and was determined to possess the Balkans. Naturally, he would not allow Serbia, which originally adhered to Orthodox Christianity, to be annexed by Austria. According to Metternich, the best course of action for the Balkans was to maintain the status quo, ideally remaining in the hands of the weakened Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire no longer possessed the strength to threaten Austria, thus ensuring Austria's safety without unduly provoking Russia. However, the matters discussed during this joint visit by Britain and Greece were somewhat unexpected for Metternich. Britain actually supported Greek occupation of the Balkans? After the initial shock and processing of the information, Metternich roughly understood the British thinking. Given the Ottoman Empire's weakness and the current situation making it difficult to guarantee resistance against Russian aggression against the Balkans, it was better for the more militarily capable Greeks to occupy the Balkans. Moreover, by occupying the Balkans, Greece had significantly offended the Russians, thus forcing it to increasingly align itself with Britain, becoming a pawn in the Near East, much like the Ottoman Empire. I'm afraid the Tsar will be furious if news of Greece's occupation of the Balkans gets out, Prime Minister Metternich thought to himself, admiring the British's clever calculations while considering Austria's stance on the matter. Austria's current national strategy prioritized unifying the German territories and exploring opportunities to annex more German states. Secondly, it aimed to strengthen its influence in Italy. The Balkans were not a primary focus in Austria's overall strategy. To be fair, the Greek occupation of the Balkans was neither a good nor a bad option for Austria's current national strategy. Even after the Ottoman Empire agreed to cede territory, Greece's primary objective remained resisting the Russians, effectively giving it an ally to prevent Russian incursions into the Balkans. In this situation, Greece, besides relying on Britain, will inevitably have to lean towards Austria. For Austria, this wouldn't be particularly bad, but compared to its current situation, the benefits are minimal. Therefore, Prime Minister Metternich believes that perhaps this situation can be used to secure some benefits for Austria. Austria doesn't have much ambition for the Balkans, but Austria's national security still needs to be guaranteed. We need the area surrounding Belgrade to ensure Austria isn't threatened. Chapter 120 The Russians who faced widespread opposition. At the Vienna Conference, each country had its own agenda. Prussia, more of a spectator, hoped to cause trouble for Austria and France and gain some benefits in the process. The Russians had never liked these kinds of conferences, and Nicholas I was not particularly enthusiastic about the Vienna Conference, knowing that Austria wanted to prevent Russia from intervening in the Balkans. However, Nicholas I also needed to gauge the thoughts of the other powers. The Polish uprising had delayed things too much, allowing Austria and Prussia to prepare. Intervening in the Balkans now could very well provoke a collective opposition from the other powers. Nicholas I didn't care about mere verbal opposition or condemnation. He wanted to know if the other powers would actually intervene militarily to stop Russia. When the Russian representative noticed that the British and Greek foreign ministers were acting together, visiting Ottoman and Austrian representatives, he sensed something was amiss and quickly sent people to find out what the two countries were doing. In fact, he soon figured it out. Palmerston had used a clever trick, deliberately leaking information that Greece was about to negotiate with Ottoman and acquire all of Austria's territory in the Balkans. The Russian representative, shocked that Greece and Britain had joined forces, immediately sent word back home. This turn of events was extremely unfavorable to Russia. Although Greece had not signed an alliance with Russia, its war against the Ottoman Empire had successfully created an opportunity for Russia to profit from the chaos. However, the Greek army's fighting power was unexpectedly strong, and within just a few months, it had occupied most of the Ottoman territory in the Balkans. If Greece and the Ottoman Empire were to negotiate peace, it would mean that Russia had lost its best opportunity to enter the Balkans. Especially with British support, the Ottoman Empire probably couldn't hold out for long, and the Balkans were about to fall into Greek hands, which was not good news for Russia. France hoped Egypt would sign a peace agreement with the Ottoman Empire as soon as possible, while remaining cautious about Greece's occupation of the Balkans. After all, Relations between Greece and France had been relatively good, and Greece was willing to cooperate with France in economic and trade matters. Even the Greek army was trained by French instructors, which gave the French a sense of pride. Regarding the war in the Near East, France hoped Egypt would withdraw its forces as soon as possible. At this time, France had many troops scattered in Texas and Northwest Africa, and with troops stationed in other regions, its forces were already stretched thin. France worried that if Russia intervened in the war and Egypt could not hold out, it would be difficult for France to provide sufficient support. Therefore, upon hearing that Greece was about to negotiate peace with the Ottoman Empire under British mediation, the French representative Thiers spoke first at the second conference. The Ottoman Empire has declined, and its excessive territory has become a burden compared to its national strength. Although Muhammad Ali comes from a barbaric world, he is a civilized man and is fully capable of leading Egypt and replacing the Ottomans as the leader of the Near East. Before Thiers could finish speaking, Palmerston interrupted him bluntly. The leader of the Near East, I think, is a French colony. Apart from you French, Egyptians are unwilling to do business with other countries, which will hinder the Near East's progress into the civilized world. Palmerston's behavior was extremely impolite, but he didn't see anything wrong with it. At this point, Britain's national power was his only support. Hearing Palmerston's words, the other powers' expressions subtly changed. Previously, their trade with the Ottoman Empire was very limited. Even Prussia, which had close ties with the Ottoman Empire, mainly supplied military personnel. However, with the signing of the trade agreement between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, other countries followed suit, all benefiting greatly. Trade with the Ottoman Empire steadily increased, and even Russia gained considerable advantages. The future seemed promising. At this point, Palmerston mentioned trade volume, and all the countries perked up. They did not want Egypt, after occupying Ottoman territory, to continue trading only with the French, excluding most other countries, as it did then. What good would that do them? In fact, Greece was only able to trade cotton with Egypt through internal French connections, and even this part of the trade was conducted under the French name. Otherwise, Egypt would not have recognized it. Moreover, the overall scale of trade was very limited. In response, Thiers retorted loudly, "How ridiculous! Don't you British constantly preach free trade? It's the Egyptians' freedom to choose who to do business with. They don't need Britain's consent at all. You British should mind your own business." Thiers had always been very averse to British interference in continental Europe, and he was equally blunt with Palmerston. "We British believe in free trade, and what we're doing now is the same. The Egyptian government's forced restrictions on merchants from other countries entering the country is an act of obstructing free trade, and we must correct their mistakes," Palmerston said. Thiers immediately retorted, "So this is what hinders free trade? Then why are our wine trades in London, Portsmouth, and Birmingham being obstructed by you? And why are Russian agricultural products and logs also being heavily taxed?" At that time, Britain was Russia's main exporter of agricultural products and logs, and Thiers' words immediately resonated with the Russian representatives. Nasser Love, a man of military background, wasn't one for subtlety and spoke directly. "That's right, Mr. Palmerston should reduce your excessively high tariffs." Seeing someone step forward, Metternich chimed in, "Yes, and our glass products are also subject to huge tariffs in England. I think England should consider it." Lord Servier, the Prussian representative, also seized the opportunity to add, "and our Prussian products." As a competent diplomat, Palmerston, of course, wouldn't let things develop in his favor, and immediately steered the conversation back on track. "We will consider the opinions of all countries. Now we are discussing how to safeguard your interests in the Ottoman Empire." Thiers was preparing to press his advantage and continue talking about free trade when the Russian representative, Nasser Love, echoed Palmerston's words, "Indeed, Russia's interests in the Ottoman Empire need to be respected by all countries. The Egyptians are currently threatening the Bosphorus Strait. To help the Ottoman Empire defend against the Egyptians, Russia is willing to send 150,000 troops." At this, everyone at the meeting felt a chill run down their spines. Everyone looked at Nasser Love, knowing that this meant Russia intended to continue encroaching on the territory of the Ottoman Empire. This was clearly not in the interests of the countries present, and Palmerston immediately objected, "No, Russian troops must not enter Ottoman territory." "Right. Russian troops cannot go south. The war between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire is a civil war, and our country will not stand by and watch other countries engage in military intervention." Thiers also strongly opposed. Although the Egyptian army performed well in the battle against the Ottoman Empire, Tyr understood that the Egyptians were not yet qualified to fight against the great powers, especially now that they had offended the British. If they were to join forces with Russia, no country in the world could currently stand alone against both Britain and Russia. Civil war? I've heard Egypt has been preparing for independence for a long time, Nasrullah said with a mocking smile, looking at the Egyptian representative. The Russian army's entry into the Ottoman Empire is indeed not on the interests of anyone here, Metternich added. Prussia then echoed Austria's stance. Seeing this, Nasrullah frowned. It seemed not only Britain, but also France, Austria, and even Prussia were strongly opposed to the Russians moving south, leaving him somewhat undecided. Thinking this, he couldn't help but glance at Greece. It seemed Austria had tacitly approved of the Greek occupation of the Baltimore Peninsula. What price had the Greeks paid? Chapter 121 The conditions that moved Austria. In fact, Greece would never relinquish the Belgrade region, which Metternich had initially proposed, because surrendering Belgrade would be tantamount to abandoning its strategic geographical advantage, leaving Greece constantly under Austria's threat. Otto understood very well that Greece's national strength was not yet comparable to Austria's. If it lost Belgrade, and if Russia insisted on going to war with Greece, Greece would have to concentrate the vast majority of its army along the Moldavian and Dobroga lines, just like the Ottoman Empire. These regions were mostly flat plains, and holding them would require a large army, leaving insufficient troops to defend other areas. At this point, without Belgrade's natural defensive advantage, the Balkans would be essentially at the mercy of Austrian convoys, something Greece could not accept. Greece proposed handing over Moldavia to the Austrian Empire, but Austria rejected this blatant attempt to divert trouble eastward. Moldavia is located on the Russian border. If Austria gained control of the region, its border with Russia would be significantly extended, especially since these border areas are mostly flat terrain that is difficult to defend. Conversely, by handing over Moldavia to Austria, Greece would have shrunk its defensive lines in the Eastern Balkans by more than half. Prime Minister Metternich, with his experience, was unlikely to fall for this. Therefore, the first meeting ended unhappily. However, the Greek foreign minister quickly requested a separate meeting with Metternich. Without Palmerston accompanying him, the foreign minister said the following to Prime Minister Metternich: Your Majesty, you should know that His Majesty King Otto of our country is of Bavarian royal lineage and was once a member of the royal families of the German states. His Majesty has always been deeply distressed by the fragmented state of the German region and has consistently supported the unification of Germany into a single great nation. Greece was willing to support Austria's unification of the German region. Prime Minister Metternich was initially delighted upon hearing this, as the unification of the various German states had long been Austria's aspiration. Especially with the rise of nationalism, the call for German unification had grown increasingly louder. Now, through the Frankfurt Conference, the most powerful of the German states, the Austrian Empire, had become the nominal leader of the German states, giving Austria a significant advantage in the pursuit of unification. However, no country in Europe today wanted to see a unified Germany. Because once unified, the strength of a unified Germany would be undeniable, perhaps even surpassing France and the current hegemon, Great Britain, to become the new dominant power on the European continent. Greece's annexation of the Balkans is now almost a foregone conclusion, and its demonstrated strength in this war is enough to earn it considerable respect from other nations. It is foreseeable that Greece will become an important country in Europe in the future. Given time, even if it doesn't become a great power, it will be recognized as a quasi-great power, like Prussia, and will have a voice in the European political landscape. If Austria can gain Greece's support in the future, it will essentially have an ally in the unification of the German region. Unless Austria is willing to pay a huge price to prevent Greece from seizing the Balkans. Having realized this, Greece clearly hopes to use such terms to win over Austria, hoping that Austria will now stand on its side. But Prime Minister Metternich quickly became wary again. As a seasoned politician, he knew that promises between nations were often worthless. If Greece was merely using empty promises to deceive Austria and then reneged on them, Austria would have no recourse against Greece if they missed their chance. So, although Prime Minister Metternich was very interested in the proposal, he did not agree immediately. Instead, he said, a mere verbal promise is not enough to gain the support of the Austrian Empire. Prime Minister Metternich's doubts were not unexpected for the foreign minister, who calmly presented his prepared terms. "Your Excellency can rest assured that Greece's promise will not remain just words. Our Emperor Otto has already persuaded His Majesty Ludwig I to support Austria's entry into the German customs union, creating the best conditions for Austria to unify the German region." The German customs union was established in 1834, consisting of 38 states of the German Confederation. Austria had also participated in the initial meeting that established the German customs union. Austria originally had the opportunity to become a member of this alliance and, based on its economic strength, to become the leader of the German customs union. However, to avoid this, Prussia rallied a group of states to strongly oppose Austria's accession. Furthermore, Britain saw the customs union as the best catalyst for German unification and thus hindered Austria's efforts. At the time, the Kingdom of Hanover was still a personal union of the British Empire. Under the instructions of William IV, the Kingdom of Hanover also opposed Austria's accession at a meeting. Coupled with a lack of internal consensus within Austria, Austria was ultimately excluded from the German customs union. After the establishment of the German customs union, Prussia greatly promoted its national development through the union, and its economy took off, reaping enormous benefits in just a few years. Thinking of this, Prime Minister Metternich couldn't help but curse inwardly. He had foreseen that joining the German customs union would be entirely beneficial to the Austrian Empire during its initial planning stages. However, there was not only external obstruction, but also strong opposition from some within the country. They argued that abolishing tariffs would affect the income of some, the entry of German goods into Austria would impact the profits of others, and even the increase in the German population in Austria would affect the social standing of some. They even mobilized various forces for this purpose, and Emperor Franz II of Austria, being easily swayed and afraid of taking responsibility, chose to maintain the status quo. Now, seeing Prussia reap enormous benefits, most of those who had initially opposed joining the German customs union began to regret their actions. However, these men refused to reflect on their past mistakes, instead resenting Metternich and His Majesty the Emperor for not firmly adhering to the German customs union, and repeatedly criticized Chancellor Metternich and His Majesty the Emperor for their inaction. Metternich was utterly disgusted by their behavior, but had no choice but to continue working with them, as they wielded immense influence in all aspects of Austria. Having missed its previous opportunity, Austria's chances of rejoining the German customs union are now slim, unless a suitable opportunity arises. Greece, it seems, is willing to provide such an opportunity. King Otto of Greece, of Bavarian royal lineage, was a key figure in opposing Austria's accession to the German customs union. If the Kingdom of Bavaria were to proactively offer Austrian membership, negotiations could resume. Furthermore, with Queen Victoria's ascension to the British throne, the Kingdom of Hanover and Great Britain are no longer a personal union, and British influence in the German-speaking regions has weakened. Once negotiations begin, Prime Minister Metternich is confident he can win over most of the German states and bring Austria into the German customs union. If things go well, with over a decade of effort, Austria might even go further, replacing Prussia and gaining absolute dominance within the German customs union. However, Metternich needs to confirm whether Greece can truly influence Ludwig I's decisions. After all, even though Otto is Ludwig I's most beloved son, he won't be easily swayed by family ties when making national decisions. Therefore, he asked, is His Majesty Ludwig I truly willing to support Austria's accession to the German customs union? To this question, the foreign minister confidently assured him, rest assured, as long as Austria is willing to recognize the status quo in the Balkans, His Majesty Ludwig I will certainly propose Austria's accession at the German customs union meeting next month. Then, given Austria's influence in the German region, coupled with Bavaria's firm support, it should not be difficult to gain the support of most of the German states. Hearing this assurance, Prime Minister Metternich was immediately satisfied and indicated that he would support Greece's interests in the Balkans at the upcoming meeting. The Austrian Empire could afford to wait less than a month. It could mobilize its own army first. If things didn't turn out that way, the Austrian army would strike and show Greece the price of deceiving the empire. Chapter 122 Conflicting Nations. In fact, Otto had no intention of deceiving Metternich. But Austria's entry into the German customs union was originally Otto's suggestion to Ludwig I, and Ludwig I had already agreed. Ludwig I's decision wasn't because Otto was his most beloved son. From a monarch's perspective, his abilities were rather mediocre, but he wouldn't easily let emotions cloud his judgment. His main reason for doing so was that the Kingdom of Prussia had indeed acted somewhat improperly. After the formation of the German Customs Union, the Kingdom of Prussia became its de facto leader. To protect its own economic interests, Prussia included numerous provisions in the Union's agreements that favored it, while simultaneously harming the economic interests of many other German states. In such an economic union, there are always those who suffer losses and those who gain advantages. Especially after the formation of the German Customs Union, Prussia absorbed the vast majority of the increased economic benefits. Bavaria, as the third largest state in the German region and second only to Prussia within the Customs Union, was a key target of Prussia's vigilance and suppression, thus suffering considerable losses both overtly and covertly. The Kingdom of Prussia, however, far surpassed the Kingdom of Bavaria in strength, especially military power, leaving Bavaria with no choice but to swallow its pride. Therefore, Otto advised Ludwig I to bring Austria into the German Customs Union, transforming Prussia's dominance into a two-way competition between Prussia and Austria. This way, Bavaria, as the most powerful third-ranked kingdom, would become the object of courtship by the first and second-ranked kingdoms, thus securing the greatest benefit for the kingdom. Based on these considerations, Ludwig I, after consulting with his ministers, decided to adopt Otto's suggestion and persuade Austria to join the German Customs Union. It can be said that Otto won over Austria with these terms without paying a single price. With British support and Austrian recognition, Greece had the confidence to hold on to its gains in the Balkans. Given another 10 years, Otto was confident he could complete the initial development of the Balkans, elevating Greece to the ranks of the great powers. The final variable rested with Russia, and Otto believed that under the overall momentum created by Greece, Russia would not act rashly. Historically, in the wars between Egypt and the Ottomans, Egypt had achieved a series of victories, and Russia, seeing this, wanted a share of the spoils. At this point, Britain, France, Austria, and Prussia united to oppose Russia, preventing it from taking advantage of the situation to invade southward. The situation was similar, facing opposition from the four countries. Russia's representative, Nasrullah, did not continue to take a hard line. Instead, he quickly reported the events of the meeting to his country, leaving the decision to Nicholas I. Besides receiving unanimous support from the vast majority of countries for preventing Russia's southward advance, the question of how to deal with the current war between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire remained a subject of intense debate. Palmerston was constantly trying to win over Austria and bring it into the British camp. His aim was not only to get Austria to recognize the status quo in the Balkans, but also to get Austria to stand with the British on issues in the Near East. Egypt's growing strength meant increased support for France, which was not in Austria's interest, given its long-standing wariness of France. France was also vying with Austria for influence in Italy, and the French and Russians would prevent Austria from annexing Germany to the north. Metternich, at this time, believed that cooperation with Britain would bring greater benefits, and Palmerston was confident that Austria would ultimately make the right choice. Of course, the French wouldn't sit idly by in support of Egypt. Thiers proactively approached Metternich, a politician who, while a staunch supporter of Napoleon, deeply disliked this man who had participated in the dismantling of the Napoleonic Empire. However, he understood that France needed allies, at least to prevent Austria from siding with Britain, otherwise Egypt would face annihilation. Thiers was confident in dealing with Britain, but not with the rest of Europe. He believed Napoleon's downfall stemmed from having too many enemies, and France couldn't afford to repeat that mistake. The French offered to share Egypt's economic interests, but this wasn't enough to satisfy Metternich, as Palmerston had promised that Austria would also share Egyptian resources with Britain after Egypt's defeat. In fact, Prime Minister Metternich had been persuaded by Britain, as Britain and Greece had more leverage to offer. Besides Egyptian interests, Britain was also willing to support Austrian interests in Italy. These conditions were enough for Austria to make a choice, so Thiers' talks with Metternich ultimately failed. For a period afterward, the various countries argued incessantly about how to treat Egypt, each with its own interests and demands. Britain gained the support of Austria and Prussia to protect the interests of the Ottoman Empire. However, the French maintained a firm stance in support of Egypt, and the conference naturally failed to reach a final conclusion. It wasn't until news of the death of Mahmud II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, arrived that, to avoid any unforeseen complications, Palmerston and the Greek foreign minister rushed to Istanbul, hoping to quickly sign a treaty with the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, in the Athens royal palace, Otto leisurely reclined on Natasha's lap, quietly listening to her sing while reading the newspaper. The newspaper's content was almost entirely focused on the recent outbreak of the Near East War, with various analyses and reports offering their opinions, leading to heated debates. After considering some of the less convincing arguments, Otto was more concerned about Russia's reaction, hoping his previous investment in Duke Liobe hadn't been wasted. After confirming that Britain and Austria were willing to support Greece, Otto knew that this Greek strategic adventure was more than half successful. The next step was to see when the Ottoman Empire surrendered. If that doesn't work, Otto can also order the army on the Evros River to tentatively march towards Constantinople, forcing the Ottomans to make an earlier decision. At this time, it can be said that Greece was the winner of Qin Shi Huang's victory when he ate Sichuan peppercorns. Even the most radical Magna Hellenists had never imagined that Greece could achieve such a glorious victory before this battle. At this time, Otto's prestige in Greece reached an unprecedented height. Countless eulogies for Otto rained down upon him. And unless Otto subsequently acted perversely and committed a series of grave errors, no one could shake his rule in Greece. However, the attitude of the Russians was equally crucial for the successful execution of this strategic plan and for securing a favorable international environment for Greece's future development. This would determine whether Greece could develop peacefully in the future, as Otto was not genuinely willing for Greece to obediently become a pawn for Britain in hindering Russian expansion. Russia had always considered the Balkans its own, and now that Greece had seized them first, it would be absurd to expect Nicholas I to accept it calmly. If Russia views Greece as a mortal enemy and deploys a large number of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border, even without a formal war, Greece would have to maintain a significant military presence to defend against a potential Russian attack. A prolonged military conflict would consume vast sums of money, placing immense pressure on Greece in all aspects and undoubtedly slowing its economic development, a situation contrary to Otto's strategic plans. Otto's royal consortium has already invested heavily in this war. Excluding the war bonds purchased, the consortium's investment alone has reached tens of millions of pounds. If it weren't for the gains from Hindu temples and gold mines in California, the royal consortium would likely be bankrupt long ago, let alone operating as it does now. Otto is now waiting for the Balkans to be annexed, so the royal consortium can control the mineral resources there, develop the Balkans, and accelerate industrialization to recoup its costs. However, if Greece needs to maintain a military presence of hundreds of thousands of troops on its borders year-round, given the Greek government's financial situation, such a large military expenditure will likely require continuous and substantial financial support from the royal consortium for at least the next decade. With much of its national power tied down by Russia, Greece naturally had less resources to invest elsewhere, causing it to miss many opportunities for expansion in other regions. From the time he became king until now, the royal consortium had devoted itself wholeheartedly to the country's development. Otherwise, this victory wouldn't have been possible. However, Otto didn't want this situation to continue. Therefore, he secretly cultivated relationships with many important Russian figures early on, hoping they could exert their influence and mediate between the two countries when the time was right. Of course, Otto knew that these mediations would at best only add to the existing problems. The best way to get a country to overcome its prejudices was to offer sufficient benefits, and in this regard, Otto believed that Greece and Russia still had many areas for cooperation. Thinking this, Otto muttered to himself, "It seems I should send an envoy to St. Petersburg as soon as possible to sound out Nicholas I's thoughts. I hope my father-in-law won't act rashly in anger and insist on making the Balkans his primary strategic target. After all, besides the Balkans, Russia has many other avenues for expansion." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 123: Proactive Negotiations. Having considered the situation in Russia, Otto refocused his attention on the newspapers, one article catching his eye. Sir John Keane of England had conquered Afghanistan, forcing King Dost Muhammad to flee Kabul for Bukhara. His son, Akbar Muhammad, now led the Afghan army in a continued war against Britain. To maintain stability in Afghanistan, the British had chosen to install Shuja Shah as their new king. In reality, Shuja Shah had been deposed for over 30 years, and his supporters had long been purged by the current King Dost. Now, Afghanistan was teeming with oil dust tribes, and Shah was utterly isolated. The British chose to support him as king, but without granting him real power. While this made him easy to control, it also meant that the British would never gain the support of the local Afghan tribes. In Otto's memory, Akbar Khan Muhammad, who now commanded the Afghan army, was a renowned military genius in Afghan history. In the original history, he ultimately defeated the British invasion and drove the British out of Afghanistan. However, this Afghan hero did not live to inherit the Afghan throne, but was poisoned by his father, Dust, due to suspicion. To whitewash this failure, many Western historians have lavishly praised Dust Muhammad. However, Otto believed that while the current king of Afghanistan, Dust, might be skilled in political maneuvering, he was far less adept at leading troops, somewhat resembling Sun Quan. Otto wondered if the more militarily capable Akbar Khan would become king of Afghanistan, and if so, the situation around the country would become more interesting. Perhaps the British in India would have to be constantly wary of the threat posed by Akbar Khan, given that the Hindu Kush mountains between Afghanistan and India were known as the Mountains of the Killers. Whether it was Genghis Khan's cavalry or other rulers who conquered India throughout history, except for the British, they all entered and conquered India from this region. Afghanistan, with its barren lands, would inevitably vie for India's lucrative territory if it aspired to become a powerful nation. Otto wanted to know how much energy the British would have left to continue their global machinations if they were constantly on guard against Afghans invading India, and whether Akbar could miraculously conquer the Indian subcontinent. With this in mind, Otto summoned his intelligence team, gave them instructions, and prepared to subtly warn Akbar through his associates at the opportune moment, a routine attempt to set a trap for the British. Whether it would work was up to Akbar's luck. By this time, Otto found himself increasingly adept at setting traps for Britain and the United States. One is the current world superpower, and the other is the future world superpower from the past. Causing trouble for these two countries whenever possible has become Otto's habit. Because of Otto's actions, the United States lost Texas and suffered even greater losses in the economic crisis. It was only thanks to the sudden natural disaster in Europe and its own strong foundation that it has begun to gradually recover. On the other hand, Otto made a fortune through arms dealing and economic speculation, and even established a foothold in present-day California. This land nominally belongs to Mexico, but due to its sparse population and numerous internal factions, Mexican control is extremely weak, allowing Greece to gain actual control of the region. Today, if the United States wants to expand as it has historically, fulfilling its manifest destiny, the difficulties it faces are far greater than before. At least the French will not easily relinquish the lucrative Texas colony. On July 1, 1839, while Otto still had the leisure to plot against Britain and the United States, Sultan Mahmud I of the Ottoman Empire did not. Mahmud I, already seriously ill from receiving news of successive defeats, was deeply affected. Later, news came that the Greeks had occupied the Balkans of the Ottoman Empire, and that Britain, which it relied on, wanted to mediate and hoped that the Ottoman Empire would recognize the Greek occupation of the Balkan Peninsula. He could no longer contain himself and roared with his last breath, "Since my ascension to the throne, I have devoted myself to the revival of the great Ottoman Empire. Why have I come to this end?" At this moment, his successor, Abdulmajid, was attending to him. Mahmud I, having exhausted his last strength, turned to him and instructed him with a hopeful tone, "Majid, although your body is weak, you are my wisest son. I believe you will become a great sultan in the future. The revival of the Ottoman Empire requires time, and we must also make good use of the contradictions between the great powers to buy the empire enough time and benefits to complete internal reforms. You must unite the people of the country, otherwise they will only recognize gold, not the nation, and the country will remain a disorganized mess." Abdulmajid simply nodded, watching Mahmud I stare with immense resentment, before swallowing his last breath. Although in future history Mahmud I is considered by many to be the greatest traitor of the Ottoman Empire, many still regard him as one of the greatest sultans. Unlike many of his ancestors, Mahmud I was neither skilled in military affairs nor in political maneuvering. In fact, during his reign, the Ottoman Empire's territory shrank continuously, and its sovereignty was undermined. However, he cleared obstacles to reform for the Ottoman Empire, using his wisdom to halt its decline and give it a chance to slowly move towards becoming a modern nation. Without his persistent efforts, the Ottoman Empire would likely have perished by now. His failures were actually the culmination of centuries of accumulated problems within the Ottoman Empire, not solely due to his personal incompetence or folly. Of course, in this timeline, Mahmud I can't shake off the label of the first traitor, since the Ottoman Empire was destined to lose the Balkans in one fell swoop. With Mahmud I's death, his son, the 16-year-old Abdülmecid, was enthroned as the new sultan. Known historically as Abdülmecid I, this newly appointed sultan appeared somewhat frail, completely different from the fierce image of previous sultans, leading many to jokingly call him the weakest sultan. However, hidden beneath this new sultan's delicate exterior was the same ambition and shrewd political maneuvering as his ancestors. Shortly after assuming office, this sultan quietly replaced key ministers in the court with his confidants. Those who dared to oppose him either died suddenly or were transferred to the front lines to fight the Egyptians. However, the Ottoman Empire at this time was like a leaky house, internally plotting to seize power from religious groups and reactionary forces, and externally facing increasing pressure from Greek and Egyptian armies. Normally, one would call upon domestic forces to unite against foreign invaders, but this sultan made a decision that surprised most people. Mejid immediately pledged to negotiate with the Greeks as soon as possible to restore peace. He also appealed to Muhammad Ali, hoping to resolve the dispute through negotiations. Finally, he summoned representatives from various countries to speak in the Flower Hall. It seems this sultan is a traitor. Without considerable perseverance and determination, it would be impossible to make such a decision so quickly. This sultan is not easy to deal with. Otto judged upon receiving news that the Ottoman Empire was preparing for negotiations and was highly likely to accept the status quo. Everyone knew that at this point, the Ottoman Empire's choice to negotiate with Greece essentially meant it was prepared to accept Greek conditions and abandon the Balkans. From this perspective alone, the new sultan seems like someone easily swayed, readily ceding vast territories. However, Otto discerned from his actions since ascending the Ottoman throne that this sultan was no ordinary man. In Otto's view, such a man's proactive sue for peace was not cowardice, but rather a resolute choice to make a drastic sacrifice in a time of crisis. Those with such courage are invariably outstanding figures. After all, the Ottoman Empire was currently facing a two-pronged attack from Greece and Egypt. A single misstep could lead to its demise. Choosing compromise at this juncture, in exchange for time and opportunity for future development, was essentially similar to what King Gaudian of Yu had done. Of course, Otto at this point had no intention of pressing his advantage. Firstly, he knew that changing the Ottoman Empire was no easy task. This corrupt empire had accumulated far too many problems over the centuries. Even some of history's most renowned leaders would have questioned whether reforming the country in a short period could achieve such a feat. Secondly, maintaining peace was still the best option for Greece. The most important thing was to first truly control the occupied territories, and then transform those territories and people into national power through economic development. It can be said that Greece also needs time to develop. Since the other party has extended an olive branch, Greece should naturally accept it. He quickly arranged for someone to send a new order to Foreign Minister Albares, who was traveling to Istanbul with Palmerston. Chapter 124 The Agreement with the Ottoman Empire. With British mediation, Greece and the Ottoman Empire reached a peace agreement, with Greece successfully acquiring Ottoman Balkan territories, excluding eastern Thrace where Istanbul is located. At the same time, Greece granted the Orthodox Church the right to freely preach within the Ottoman Empire, laying the foundation for future Greek infiltration into Ottoman-held regions such as Anatolia. However, despite British mediation, Greece did not receive reparations from the Ottoman Empire. Besides the swift return of Macedonian prisoners of war, Greece was also required to assist the Ottoman Empire in withdrawing its troops from the Moldavia and Dobroga lines. The Ottoman Empire's troops stationed along the Moldavia-Dobroga line were meticulously crafted to counter the elite forces of Russia, its greatest enemy, and were crucial for the Ottoman Empire's subsequent defense against Egypt. Palmerston specifically warned Greece against causing trouble for the Ottoman Empire during this process, demanding a swift and smooth handover of the defensive lines to avoid any conflict. He also stated that Britain would not support Greece's claims against the Ottoman Empire regarding reparations. From Britain's perspective, Palmerston was unwilling to excessively weaken the Ottoman Empire. After losing the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire was severely weakened. If it were to incur further massive reparations, it risked a prolonged period of decline, unable to withstand Russian expansion. Therefore, the British sided with the Ottoman Empire on the issue of reparations, demanding that Greece relinquish its claims. To avoid offending the British, Otto ultimately instructed his foreign secretary to agree to their terms and abandon the Ottoman Empire's reparations obligations. In exchange, the Ottoman Empire had to cede suzerainty over Tunisia to Greece, and Greece, after its involvement in the war against Egypt, would also participate in the division of Egyptian interests, seeking greater gains. The Tunisian region was originally part of the Ottoman Empire's territory in North Africa. After the Ottoman Empire was established in 1299, it actively expanded outwards, reaching Tunisia in the early 16th century, where it engaged in numerous wars with Spain. Finally, in 1574, the Ottomans expelled Spanish forces from Tunisia, established a province of Tunisia, and appointed a governor to govern the region. However, as the Ottoman Empire weakened, its influence over the border region of Tunisia also declined. This continued until 1705 when Bey Hassan ibn Ali Turki, leading his own army, overthrew the Ottoman Pasha in Tunisia and established the Hassan dynasty. The Ottomans had effectively lost control of the region. Hassan was a shrewd man. After gaining actual rule over Tunisia, he clearly understood that although the Ottoman Empire was declining, it was still not a force Tunisia could easily contend with. Therefore, Saddam Hussein chose to continue submitting to the Ottoman Empire, signifying his acceptance of the Ottoman Sultan's leadership. Thus, nominally, Tunisia remained part of the Ottoman Empire, albeit with considerable autonomy. By the 19th century, Tunisia had almost completely broken free from Ottoman control, becoming a de facto independent nation. Tunisia now possesses its own army and navy, issues its own currency, and establishes diplomatic relations or treaties with other countries under the Tunisian name. Like Egypt today. Aside from paying symbolic tributes to the Ottoman Empire, Tunisia is virtually indistinguishable from an independent state. Greece's demand for suzerainty over Tunisia was a clear indication of its ambitions in North Africa. However, after careful consideration, Palmerston believed that expanding Greek influence into North Africa would not be detrimental to Britain, and might even be advantageous. At that time, French troops were invading Algeria, which bordered Tunisia. If Greece were to annex Tunisia, it would inevitably create friction with France, which was actively expanding its North African colonies. Given the century-long animosity between Britain and France, the British were willing to go to great lengths to cause trouble for the French. Furthermore, Greece's desire to expand in North Africa would inevitably lead to competition with France. To counter France, it would have to align itself further with Britain, which would also allow Britain to exert more influence over Greece. Therefore, after careful consideration, Palmerston persuaded Sultan Mejid I to accept Greece's demands for Tunisia. Having just been prepared to accept the humiliating cession of Balkan territory, Sultan Mejid I nearly snapped upon hearing these conditions. However, the British persuasion forced Mejid I to reluctantly acknowledge that the Ottoman Empire's sovereignty over Tunisia was at most nominal. In reality, Tunisia was already an independent nation. Especially after suffering several crushing defeats this year, the Ottoman Empire's prestige and national strength have been severely damaged. Prior to this, Tunisia's Ahmed al-Bey, dissatisfied with merely being a high-ranking official within the Ottoman Empire, had repeatedly spoken on various occasions demanding Tunisia's complete separation from the Ottoman Empire and its independent control. It can be said that the Tunisian desire for independence from the Ottoman Empire was common knowledge. They were practically ready to openly declare their independence to other countries in formal diplomatic settings. Given the current state of the Ottoman Empire, it's difficult to guarantee that the persistently rebellious Tunisia won't seize this opportunity to take a risk. If such a situation arises, the Ottoman Empire, which can't even afford the military funds to quell the rebellion, might as well hand over Tunisia to Greece. Palmerston even guaranteed to help the Ottoman Empire recover a sum of compensation from Greece, somewhat alleviating its dire financial straits. Ultimately, after some haggling, Greece agreed to purchase all ownership of Tunisia for 10 million dramaraks, approximately £500,000. The final treaty was formally signed in Istanbul on November 26, 1839, and simultaneously announced to the world. This marked Greece's transformation from a small country with a territory of less than 100,000 square kilometers into regional power with 500,000 square kilometers of territory, becoming a pivotal nation in the Near East. News of the treaty between Greece and the Ottoman Empire immediately received support from Austria. Prussia, while not publicly recognizing it, did not oppose it either. Although France was angered by Greece's expansion into North Africa, Its long-standing counterinsurgency campaign in Algeria significantly reduced its domestic motivation to conquer North Africa. Conversely, the enormous profits from the Texas colony fueled the French interest in expanding their North American colonies, leading them to merely express a willingness to closely monitor the situation without any intention of antagonizing Greece. Almost all the major powers were waiting to see Russia's reaction, eager to gauge whether Nicholas I would swallow this insult. Meanwhile, upon receiving news of its betrayal, Tunisia immediately protested. Mustafa Khaznadal, then Grand Vizier of Tunisia, publicly declared that Greece and the Ottoman Empire had disregarded Tunisia's wishes and unilaterally decided its fate. Tunisia would not recognize the treaty and would henceforth become an independent nation. Faced with this situation, Otto immediately convened a cabinet meeting to discuss how Greece should respond to Tunisia's declaration of independence. At the start of the meeting, Otto spoke first. "Gentlemen, Ahmed Bey of Tunisia seems unwilling to accept the kingdom's rule, and has even openly declared independence. What do you all think we should do?" "Your Majesty, the entire navy is ready and can march into Tunisia at any time," said Lieutenant General Iarsis, the naval representative, immediately stepping forward. "The Army's 4 newly formed divisions have a completed training and are ready to cross the Mediterranean and conquer Tunisia at any time," General Corinth retorted, indicating that the army was also prepared for battle. Since the great victory over the Ottoman Empire, the Greek people were largely in high spirits, and the war's achievements had propelled a number of military officers into the Greek nobility. Hundreds of officers became lifelong nobles, receiving titles of nobility, and some even attained baronies or viscounts. Although Otto did not grant extensive fiefdoms, in this era, becoming a noble was a source of great pride and a lifelong pursuit for many. Having tasted the benefits, the military naturally became the vanguard of expansion, and its attitude was not entirely unexpected. At this moment, Prime Minister Sano stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, I think the matter of invading Tunisia should be carefully considered." According to intelligence, the French seem to be negotiating with Tunisia, preparing to sell a batch of arms to Tunisia. With the fighting strength of the Tunisians, even with the latest weapons, they cannot possibly defeat the kingdom's army. General Corinth shouted, "Your Majesty, just give me 3 divisions, and I am confident that I can crush Tunisia." Prime Minister Sanos immediately retorted, "But the kingdom's war in the Balkans is not completely over yet. The Russians have quelled the Polish rebellion, and Nicholas I's army is already deployed along the Moldavian Dobroga line. Although the Austrians tacitly acknowledge the kingdom's occupation of the Balkans, there's no guarantee they won't act you if they discover any weaknesses in the kingdom. Starting a new war at that point would be detrimental to the kingdom. While our nation has achieved brilliant results in this year's war, the price has been enormous. The kingdom's debt is now approaching 200 million drachmas, equivalent to several years' worth of national revenue. To stabilize the newly occupied territories, we have exempted these regions from taxes this year. If war continues, the government may face bankruptcy." Chapter 125 Financial Difficulties. As the Prime Minister of Greece, Sanos naturally hoped for Greece's continued expansion and a stronger nation, which would bring him greater honor and status. However, from the outset, Sanos opposed Otto's decision to shift his focus to North Africa at this time. Greece had just ended its war with the Ottoman Empire, and large swathes of newly conquered territory had not yet been consolidated, leaving the government facing immense financial pressure. While Greece seemed to have the support of most of the major powers, it remained uncertain whether the greatest potential threat, the Russian Empire, would accept such an outcome. While the marriage of Otto and Nicholas I certainly brought the Greek and Russian royal families together, this relationship is far from secure in the face of national interests. Russia's covetousness of the Balkans is well known, and Greece's move to seize this coveted territory can be seen as a significant offense to the Russian Empire, potentially placing Greece under pressure from Russia's powerful army. Despite the Greek army's impressive performance in the recent war, whether it could withstand the Tsar's army remained questionable. In Thanos's view, Greece's best option was to guard its borders, refrain from further involvement in any conflicts, focus on development, expand its territory, and strengthen its national power before considering other matters. Judging from King Otto's recent instructions, he clearly intended to follow Britain and intervene in the war between Austria and Egypt. This would be understandable. Given British support, the chances of victory against Egypt were still high. However, Otto has now turned his attention to North Africa. It's only because Thanos is unaware of the concept of exhausting resources for military expansion that he should be issuing a strong warning to Otto against such a policy. Because of this thinking, when the military supported the war, Prime Minister Sanos suggested avoiding war with Tunisia if possible. He argued that it would be best to appease Tunisia through diplomatic means first, and then resolve the Tunisian problem a few years later when resources were more available. Therefore, a dispute arose between the Greek cabinet and the military regarding military intervention in Tunisia, and neither side could convince the other for a time. Seeing this, Otto first stopped the argument between the two sides, and then said, "Gentlemen, please calm down. The Tunisian issue is now intertwined with the internal and external situations facing Greece, which makes it difficult to make a decision. So let's solve the problems that Greece needs to face at this stage one by one. The first and most important issue is the defense of the Balkan Peninsula. How has the military arranged this? Your Majesty, our defense in the Balkans is mainly divided into three directions," General Corinth said, namely, the northern defense line centered on Belgrade to defend against Austria, the northeastern defense line along the Mordavia and Dobroga line to defend against Russia, and the eastern defense line near Constantinople. On the northern defense line, we deployed 3 divisions, and also planned to incorporate 3 more divisions from the Balkan partisans, totaling 6 divisions and 100,000 men, forming the Northern Army Corps, stationed on the northern border centered on Belgrade. The northeastern defense line was centered on 5 divisions, plus 3 divisions reorganized from local partisans, and 2 of our most elite independent artillery regiments, totaling 150,000 men, forming the Northeast Army Corps, concentrating our strongest forces. Finally, on the eastern defense line, of the 2 Guards Corps originally stationed there, 1 was transferred to the Northeast Army Corps, and the remaining Guards Division, along with 2 divisions formed from local partisans, formed the Eastern Army Corps, totaling 54,000 men, to defend against the Ottoman Empire. In addition, there were 4 reserve divisions near Athens, and with the troops stationed in the kingdom's overseas colonies, the kingdom had a total of 18 divisions and 250,000 regular troops. Given the size of the territory Greece currently occupies and the situation it faces, assembling an army of 250,000 men is not considered large. However, because the newly occupied territories have not yet been integrated and cannot provide tax revenue for the government, at this juncture, a massive army of 250,000 men inevitably places an extremely heavy burden on the nation. Furthermore, the guerrilla reorganized army and reserve divisions, due to insufficient training time and inadequate equipment supply, cannot fully guarantee their combat effectiveness. This problem also requires time to resolve. The army has just completed its deployment across various regions. To defend against a potential Russian attack, the 3 lines of defense, especially the one under the Northeast Army Corps, require enormous effort to repair fortresses, establish defenses, and stockpile combat materials, all consuming substantial resources and money. Otto knew that to cope with this sudden increase in national defense pressure, large numbers of guerrillas from various regions had been conscripted into the army. Many others joined local police forces, while only about 1 in 4 were transferred to local reserve teams to return to local work and production, which actually had a significant impact on production in these areas. The military's arrangements are quite sound, Otto said slowly after a moment's thought. The defense of the 3 Army Corps lines cannot be relaxed, so right now we can only freely mobilize the Navy and 4 reserve divisions. At the same time, just in case, we need to keep enough reserves in the country, which means that if war breaks out with Tunisia, the army can only mobilize 1 division at most. Although Greece practices a conscription system, for this year's war, almost all eligible adult men in the Greek peninsula have been drafted, and even many of the laborers who originally came to Greece have been incorporated into the army. As for the newly occupied territories, even with forced conscription, these new recruits would take at least several months, or even half a year, before they could be of use. Therefore, the reserve forces of the 4 divisions around Athens became crucial. Before Russia declared war on Greece, it was best not to mobilize too many, ensuring Greece possessed sufficient strategic mobility. Your Majesty, General Corinth emphasized at this point, even a single division, with the support of the Navy, is enough for the military to defeat Tunisia. Naval Commander Laris also stepped forward and said, Your Majesty, in addition to the fleet, the Navy also has 2 regiments of 6,000 Marines, which can also assist the Army's operations. No rush? Let me tell you about the country's finances and material reserves. Otto smiled and waved his hand, looking at Prime Minister Sanos. Your Majesty. Prime Minister Sanos bowed first, and then said, "For this year's war, the government has issued a total of 150 million dreimarks of war bonds so far. Using these funds, my country stockpiled a large amount of food and military supplies before the war, including 16 million bullets, 2.3 million artillery shells, as well as medical supplies, tents, shovels, and other military supplies. Much of these supplies had been consumed in the past wars, especially ammunition. Only 6.4 million bullets and 1.6 million artillery shells remained. Medical supplies and other supplies were consumed less, but the divisions formed by guerrillas throughout the Balkans mostly used old-fashioned muzzle-loading rifles. Therefore, our troops still have a large number of weapons that need to be replaced. Domestic military-related factories are still operating at full capacity to fill these weapon shortages and replenish sufficient ammunition and supplies. Because the war has progressed more smoothly than expected, we still have a quarter of the prepared war funds remaining. However, according to our calculations, even if we used all the remaining war funds, it wouldn't be enough to cover the subsequent replenishment of military supplies, plus the pensions and bonuses for the troops. To stabilize the newly occupied territories, we have exempted taxes for this year. Furthermore, the Balkan Peninsula lacks substantial industry, and the bulk of the tax revenue comes from land tax and poll tax. However, our government is short-staffed, and the management of newly occupied territories will be difficult to extend to the grassroots level in a short period. Coupled with the current assimilation policy, a decline in tax revenue in these areas in recent years is almost foreseeable. As a result, next year's increase in fiscal revenue may not even be enough to allow the government to repay its debts and maintain normal operations. In other words, even without significant fiscal expenditures, our finances will be in financial ruin by next year. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.